Hey there. Welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping back into the world of the Medellin Cartel, but not to talk about Escobar. No, tonight belongs to the ones history tried to forget. The Ochoa brothers. Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio. The businessmen behind the empire. The men who gave Pablo Escobar his wings, and then quietly walked away while the world was still staring at him. Some called them the Forgotten Kings. Others, the silent architects of the cocaine trade. But their story is bigger than just shadows. It's a tale of family, power, fear, and the dangerous game of survival. Before we dive in, do me a favor, drop a comment and let me know, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it there? It's always wild seeing this little outlaw circle of ours stretching across countries and time zones. And hey, if you're new here, welcome. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell too. That way, you'll never miss the next journey into the underworld. All right, get comfortable. Let the noise of the day fade out, and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons. Your sleepy dawn. The world remembers Pablo Escobar. His name has been burned into headlines, movies, and whispered into late-night conversations as the king of cocaine, the man who ruled with bullets and bombs. His face has become an icon of terror and wealth, forever stitched into the mythology of crime. But behind Escobar's legend, in the shadows where most people never looked, stood three brothers. Quiet, calculated, patient. They built the empire that allowed Escobar to rise. And when the fires consumed him, they slipped away almost unnoticed. Jorge Luis, Juan David, Fabio, the Ochoa brothers. Their story does not begin with gunfire or with the roar of an airplane carrying tons of cocaine. It begins with silence, with the weight of money stacked in quiet rooms, with the unshakable calm of businessmen who understood that true power is not always loud, not always bloody. They knew Escobar's rage could set the world on fire, but they also knew that without them, the Medellin Cartel would never have become the empire history remembers. Picture Colombia in the late 1970s. Medellin, a city caught between the mountains and the weight of its own poverty, was already alive with whispers of cocaine. Escobar was just beginning his climb, hungry, reckless, eager to be feared. But cocaine empires are not built by ambition alone. They are built by structure, by money, by connections that cross oceans. And that was what the Ochoas brought. The brothers were sons of a wealthy cattle rancher, raised in comfort, schooled in discipline. They were not born into the streets, not hardened by hunger the way Escobar was. Their world was one of fine horses, expensive tastes, and the easy charm of old money. Yet behind those polite smiles, behind the crisp shirts and polished shoes, was the same hunger that drove Escobar. A hunger for more. Imagine a poker game where every player is showing his cards, bluffing, trying to dominate the table. Escobar was the loud one, the man who slammed his chips down with fire in his eyes. But the Ochoas were the ones who barely spoke. They sipped their drinks, measured every move, and waited. In the end, it was often the quiet player who walked away with the pot. The first time the world truly saw the Ochoas, they weren't the ones holding guns. They weren't on the front lines of Escobar's bloody war against the state. They were businessmen orchestrating deals, moving cocaine across borders as if they were shipping livestock or produce. To them, this was logistics, not chaos. And for a time, their way worked. But history has a cruel way of choosing who to remember. The Ochoas faded into the background as Escobar's madness consumed the spotlight. He was the bombings. He was the assassinations. He was the man who declared war on an entire nation. And yet, when Escobar's empire fell, it wasn't his family that remained standing. It was theirs. In the dusty records of old newspapers, you'll find the brothers mentioned almost in passing. A surrender here, an arrest there. But what those headlines do not tell you is how much control they truly held, and how carefully they built their survival. They lived in a world where one wrong move meant death, where loyalty was always balanced against betrayal. They walked that razor's edge with precision, and somehow they lived to tell the tale. Think of Escobar as the storm, violent, unpredictable, devastating. And think of the Ochoas as the mountain range that stood behind it, solid, unmoving, not always visible in the chaos, but always there, shaping the wind. Without the Ochoas, there would have been no Medellin Cartel, no billion-dollar empire, no Pablo Escobar as history remembers him. Still, their silence came with a price. To survive in Escobar's world, you had to be willing to vanish when the lights turned on you. The Ochoas were masters of that art. When Escobar waged his war against extradition, blowing up planes, murdering judges, terrorizing Colombia into submission, the brothers remained cautious. They stepped back when the blood was too much, negotiated when Escobar would only rage, and made sure their exits were planned long before his. It is tempting to think of them as ghosts, slipping in and out of history without leaving footprints. But that is not true. Their footprints are everywhere, in the blood-soaked soil of Medellin, in the cocaine highways that stretch from Colombia to Miami, in the billions of dollars that pass through hands like water. They were not ghosts. They were architects. And yet, the question lingers. How did three brothers manage to build such a fortune, stand beside the most violent drug lord the world had ever seen, and still survive when so many others died? Was it luck? Or was it something colder, something sharper? We are left with shadows, fragments, stories told by rivals and by police reports. But in those shadows, a picture emerges, not of reckless killers or flamboyant criminals, but of men who understood that power is not only about being feared. Sometimes, the truest power is being forgotten. When Escobar's empire burned to the ground, the Ochoas were not the ones hunted to the last breath. They were not shot on rooftops or displayed to the world as trophies of war. They negotiated. They surrendered on their own terms. And then they disappeared back into quiet lives, leaving Escobar to take the blame for an empire they had helped to design. It's easy to see why history forgot them. Stories thrive on noise, and the Ochoas were silence itself. Escobar gave the world explosions, kidnappings, assassinations. The Ochoas gave it logistics, connections, money. Escobar was a nightmare. The Ochoas were a shadow. But every nightmare is cast by a shadow, and this one was theirs. Close your eyes and imagine Colombia again. Imagine the bombs, the funerals, the terrified faces of judges who knew their names were on a list. Now strip Escobar out of that picture and ask yourself, who is still there? The answer is the Ochoas. They were there at the birth of the cartel. They were there at its peak, and they were there at its end. The story of Escobar is the story of chaos, but the story of the Ochoa brothers is the story of survival. It is the tale of men who learned to let someone else take the blame while they built their own quiet escape. So tonight, we peel back the shadow. We step past the legend of Escobar and walk into the quieter rooms where the real deals were made. We open the doors to the Ochoa family ranches, the stables of their prize-winning horses, the hidden bank accounts, and the whispered negotiations that kept them alive. We ask the question no one wants to answer. What happens when the true kings of an empire decide to step back and let someone else take the crown? The Ochoa brothers lived in a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was always one conversation away. Every handshake could be fatal. Every promise could be broken. And yet, somehow they endured. Their silence was not weakness. It was strategy. While Escobar painted himself into a corner with violence, the Ochoas built a door and walked through it. While Escobar became a ghost hunted by the state, the Ochoas became ghosts by choice. But silence has its own price. In the underworld, disappearing does not mean being forgotten by everyone. It only means the world above has stopped looking. In the barrios of Medellin, in the secret corridors of Colombian politics, in the halls of American law enforcement, the name Ochoa still carried weight. It was the name of men who had stood at the top of the world and chosen not to fall. And so the story begins, not with Escobar, but with the shadows behind him, with three brothers who understood that power is not always the man holding the gun. Sometimes it is the man holding the leash. But how did it start? How did three sons of a cattle rancher go from quiet wealth to the cocaine trade that would change the world? How did they cross that line between legitimate business and the underworld, between respectability and infamy? The answer lies not in Escobar's rage or in the bombs that shook Colombia, but in Medellin itself, in the city's restless heartbeat, in the opportunities and dangers of the 1970s. It was there, before Escobar became a name the world would never forget, that the Ochoa brothers began building the empire that history almost forgot. And that is where our journey takes us next. It begins not with cocaine, but with marijuana. Before Pablo Escobar became the face of an empire, before the Ochoa brothers took their place at the table, Medellin was already humming with the quiet rhythm of smuggling. The 1970s were years when Colombia's underworld was still finding its identity. Marijuana was the first fortune, the first taste of what was possible when borders could be bent and law enforcement could be bought. And hidden in that green smoke was the promise of something much more powerful. Picture a small plane lifting off from a clandestine airstrip carved into the countryside. No runway lights, just the hum of an engine, the darkness of the night, and the knowledge that one wrong move could mean prison or worse. On board, bundles of marijuana packed tight, bound for the beaches of Miami. To the pilots, these flights were lifelines, each one paying more than years of honest work ever could. To the men behind them, these flights were whispers of the empire still to come. In Medellin, the underworld was a patchwork. Smugglers moved emeralds, cattle, coffee, guns, anything that could cross borders and turn a profit. It was not yet dominated by cartels or blood-soaked wars. It was still personal, still small enough that fortunes could rise overnight. And in this landscape, men like Escobar saw opportunity. But Escobar did not invent the game. He walked into a city where smuggling was already as natural as breathing. Medellin was a city of narrow streets and restless ambition, where poverty pressed against wealth like two fists grinding into each other. To the poor, crime was not rebellion, it was survival. To the wealthy, crime was not desperation, it was business. That was the paradox of Medellin. It was a city where morality bent beneath the weight of necessity. At the heart of this underworld were the marijuana bonanzas. By the early 1970s, American demand for Colombian marijuana had exploded. Entire coastal regions became fields of green, and farmers who once scraped by with subsistence crops suddenly found themselves supplying a booming black market. The money was fast, the risks were high, and the young men of Medellin were watching closely. Escobar, still just a name whispered in the barrios, was one of them. He started small, stealing tombstones, hustling cigarettes, hijacking trucks. But what set him apart was his ability to see the bigger picture. While others fought for scraps, Escobar was already dreaming of building an empire. And when cocaine arrived, he would seize it. But the cocaine trade did not begin in Colombia. It started further south, in Bolivia and Peru, where the coca leaf had been part of culture for centuries. In the early 70s, American scientists and traffickers discovered just how potent the processed powder could be. At first, it was the drug of the elite, a glamorous accessory in nightclubs from New York to Los Angeles. But glamour has a way of feeding appetite, and appetite has a way of feeding business. Very quickly, cocaine was no longer a luxury. It was becoming a tidal wave. The wave needed channels, and Medellin was perfectly placed. Colombia's geography, mountains that hid labs, coastlines that stretched for miles, a location bridging South and North America, made it the ideal pipeline. And Medellin's smuggling culture provided the people willing to take the risk. This was the soil in which the Medellin Cartel would grow. Yet in the early days, cocaine was still a whisper. Small shipments, quiet deals, men in fine suits sitting across from pilots and hustlers, trading cash for white powder in dimly lit rooms. The profit margins were staggering. A kilo bought in Peru for a few $1,000s could sell in Miami for 10 times that amount. It was like turning paper into gold. And once men tasted that kind of wealth, there was no going back. But cocaine was not just another product. It carried a different kind of weight. Marijuana might have filled prisons, but cocaine would fill graveyards. The men who moved it were no longer just smugglers. They were stepping into a world where violence became currency, where betrayal could come from family, and where the state itself would eventually become the enemy. In Medellin, that transformation was beginning. Men who had once moved cattle or emeralds were now turning to cocaine. They built airstrips hidden in the jungle, carved secret routes through the mountains, and paid off police with suitcases of cash. The city was becoming a laboratory for organized crime. And in this crucible, the Ochoa brothers were watching. They were not the first to move cocaine. They were not even the first to make money from it. But unlike many, they had something most smugglers lacked: stability. Their family ranches gave them legitimacy. Their wealth gave them security. Their education gave them polish. And their connections gave them doors that others could only dream of opening. The Ochoas understood something that Escobar, in those early days, did not. Empires are not built by bullets alone. They are built by networks, by logistics, by money that moves silently, like blood through the veins of body. While Escobar would always chase the fire, the Ochoas would chase the structure. By the late 1970s, Medellin was shifting. Cocaine was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Miami was drowning in white powder, its streets soaked in both money and blood. Colombian traffickers were flooding the market, and American law enforcement was scrambling to keep up. Miami became a battlefield, the so-called cocaine capital of the world, where shootouts erupted in broad daylight and morgues overflowed with bodies. But before those headlines, before the Miami drug wars, the stage had to be set. And that stage was Medellin in the 70s, a city buzzing with ambition, fear, and opportunity. A city where young men with nothing could become millionaires overnight, and men with everything could lose it just as fast. To walk the streets of Medellin then was to feel the tension in the air. You could see it in the nightclubs, where dealers flaunted gold chains and rolled $100 bills to sniff their own product. You could see it in the barrios, where families watched as neighbors suddenly bought new cars, new homes, new lives. And you could see it in the eyes of the young men who wanted in, who would do anything to taste that wealth. The police saw it too, but many chose to look away. Corruption was not just a temptation. It was a way of life. A bribe could turn a blind eye, silence a witness, make evidence vanish. For many officers, the choice was simple: fight a war they could never win, or take the money and survive. Most took the money, and so Medellin slid deeper into the underworld. Every flight out of the city could be carrying cocaine. Every ranch could be hiding a lab. Every handshake could be a deal. The line between legal and illegal blurred until it almost disappeared. This was the city Escobar stepped into. This was the world the Ochoa brothers would soon help shape. A city where ambition was fuel and cocaine was fire. But fire spreads. And once it spreads, it consumes. By the end of the decade, Medellin would no longer be just a city. It would be the beating heart of a global empire. An empire that reached from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of New York, from the ranches of wealthy families to the nightclubs of Miami. And at its center would be men who understood that power was not just about violence. It was about control. Escobar would become the face of that empire. But the Ochoa brothers would be its skeleton, the structure that held it together. And while the world remembers the storm, it is the bones that last. Yet, in the late 70s, no one could see that far ahead. The city was still on the edge of transformation. Escobar was still just a rising figure, bold, but not yet dominant. The Ochoas were still respectable ranchers, not yet infamous. The empire had not yet been built, but all the pieces were falling into place. And in those quiet moments, before the bombs and the wars, Medellin held its breath. Because soon, the shadows would not be enough to contain what was coming. Soon, the city would belong to the cocaine kings. And among those kings, the Ochoa brothers were already waiting. The Ochoa name was not born in blood. It was born in cattle. Before they became the silent architects of cocaine, the brothers were heirs to respectability. Their father, Fabio Ochoa Restrepo, was a rancher, a horse breeder, and a man whose reputation stretched beyond Medellin's borders. In Colombia's equestrian circles, his name was spoken with reverence. His Paso Fino horses were champions, animals that moved with the elegance of silk and the discipline of steel. To own an Ochoa horse was to own prestige itself. Imagine the world they grew up in. Rolling hills outside Medellin, pastures dotted with cattle, the sound of hooves striking earth in rhythmic cadence. This was not the poverty-stricken barrio childhood of Pablo Escobar. The Ochoa children were raised in comfort, with polished boots and well-fed stomachs. They knew the smell of leather saddles, not the stench of desperation. But even in those pastures, the whispers of change were already blowing in with the cocaine trade. The Ochoas did not step into the underworld because of hunger. They stepped into it because they saw opportunity. Where Escobar clawed his way upward with fury, the Ochoas glided toward it with calculation. Fabio, the patriarch, was a man who believed in discipline, loyalty, and pride. He was not a gangster. He was a businessman, a breeder, a symbol of Colombian tradition. But his sons were coming of age in a world shifting under their feet. Jorge Luis, the eldest, carried the seriousness of a man destined to lead. Juan David, sharp and charming, moved easily through conversations, a natural negotiator. Fabio, the youngest, was restless, bold, eager to prove himself. Together, they were not outcasts or rebels. They were heirs who understood that power could come from both respectability and risk. Picture them in the late 1970s. At horse shows, they were celebrities, their family stables winning trophies, crowds applauding their elegance. At ranches, they were respected landowners, surrounded by friends and admirers. But behind the smiles, behind the polished saddles, another path was being carved. One foot remained in the world of horses. The other was stepping into the shadows of cocaine. The transition was not sudden. It was not the kind of desperate leap Escobar had made. It was gradual, almost seamless, like water finding its way downhill. First, it was acquaintances. Businessmen who spoke in quiet tones about opportunities. Flights to Miami, where fortunes were being made overnight. Then it was investments, small shipments, hidden behind legitimate ranching exports. And soon, the brothers realized that cocaine was not just another business. It was the business. To understand their choice, you must understand Colombia in that moment. The cocaine boom was not simply a criminal enterprise. It was an economic revolution. Farmers who once scraped by with beans and maize were suddenly earning more in a month than they had in years. Middlemen who once traded coffee were now trafficking powder worth fortunes. For many families, cocaine was not evil. It was salvation. And for the Ochoas, it was not poverty they sought to escape. It was the ceiling. Cocaine was a way to break past the limits of legitimate wealth, to move from comfort into power. They had advantages few others did. Their ranches provided cover for clandestine meetings. Their horses allowed them to travel internationally with respectability. Their social status opened doors in politics, banking, and law enforcement. They were not street dealers. They were men who could move in high circles while their product moved in the shadows. Jorge Luis, the eldest, quickly became the steady hand. He understood risk, measured every deal, and knew when to push forward or when to step back. Juan David was the diplomat, the one who could smile through negotiations, charm potential allies, and smooth over conflict. And Fabio, the youngest, was the bold spirit, reckless at times, but also fearless. Together, they formed a triangle of power, each balancing the other. It is tempting to think of them as businessmen who stumbled into crime. But that would be a mistake. They knew exactly what they were doing. They saw the profits, the risks, the blood that was already being spilled, and still they moved forward. Perhaps they believed their wealth and connections would shield them. Perhaps they believed they could keep one foot in respectability even as the other sank into the underworld. But cocaine is a tide. Once it rises, it swallows everything in its path. The Ochoa family ranch became more than a place of horses. It became a hub of quiet power. At public events, they were still celebrated breeders. Behind closed doors, their ranch served as a meeting ground for men who would later be named among the most feared traffickers in history. Deals were struck beneath the same roofs that had once sheltered saddles and bridles. Horses grazed in the fields while, inside, shipments were planned that would flood the streets of Miami and New York with powder. This duality was the essence of the Ochoas. To the outside world, they remained respectable. To the underworld, they were indispensable. Their father, Fabio Ochoa, always denied involvement in his son's activities. To him, the family's honor was untouchable, preserved in the gleam of his horses and the respect of his peers. And yet, whispers spread that he must have known that no father could be blind to the scale of wealth his sons were moving. Was he complicit, or was he simply unwilling to see the shadows creeping across his pastures? History does not give us a clear answer. What is clear is that the Ochoas thrived. By the late 1970s, they were not just participants. They were leaders. And when Escobar's ambition began to burn hotter, it was the Ochoas who provided the structure to make his empire possible. Escobar was fury and fire, but fury needs fuel. The Ochoas were that fuel. Their money, their connections, their logistics turned Escobar's dreams into reality. Without them, he might have remained another street dealer. With them, he became the face of a cartel that would terrify the world. And yet, the brothers never sought the spotlight. They never craved the infamy Escobar embraced. They played a longer game, one built not on explosions and headlines, but on patience and survival. Think of them as the foundation of a house, invisible beneath the surface, holding everything in place, while above them Escobar painted the walls with blood. When the walls collapsed, the foundation remained. But foundations crack under pressure. And for the Ochoas, the pressure was growing. The more cocaine they moved, the more enemies they made. Rivals in Miami, guerrilla groups in Colombia, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. Every deal carried risk. Every ally could turn into a betrayer. The brothers carried themselves with calm, but inside they must have felt the weight. They were young men playing a game where the stakes were life and death, building an empire in a world where no one could be trusted. Perhaps they reassured themselves that their family name, their respectability, would shield them. But deep down, they must have known that sooner or later, the line between ranchers and traffickers would vanish completely. And when that line vanished, there would be no turning back. In the quiet fields of their ranches, as horses grazed and trophies gleamed on polished shelves, the brothers stood at a crossroads. Ahead lay unimaginable wealth, but also unimaginable danger. They had the skills, the connections, the ambition. They had everything they needed to become kings of an empire. What they did not yet realize was how much blood would be spilled to keep that empire standing. Because soon, they would not just be ranchers dabbling in cocaine. They would be co-founders of the Medellin Cartel, partners to Pablo Escobar, players in a game that would drag Colombia into decades of violence. And once that step was taken, there would be no stepping back. The moment came when hesitation was no longer possible. The Ochoa brothers were no longer wealthy ranchers dipping their toes into the cocaine trade. They were in, fully. And from that moment forward, every choice they made would shape not only their lives, but the very architecture of the Medellin Cartel. It began with quiet roles, small shipments hidden among legitimate goods, favors called in from pilots, friends in Miami who knew how to sell discreetly. But like a fire taking root in dry grass, their involvement spread quickly. Too quickly. The profits were staggering, the risks intoxicating, and before long, the brothers had moved from side players to central figures. Each of them carried a different piece of the puzzle. Jorge Luis, the eldest, carried the weight of leadership. He was calm, deliberate, the one who could look at chaos and see structure. If the Medellin Cartel was a storm, Jorge Luis was the anchor trying to hold it steady. He handled negotiations, measured the risks, and kept the business from collapsing under its own greed. Juan David was the diplomat, smooth-tongued, quick with a smile, the kind of man who could sit across from a potential rival and turn him into an ally. He had a gift for reading people, for knowing when to push and when to retreat. In a world where betrayal was constant, Juan David could disarm suspicion with nothing more than charm. He was the voice of reason, the man who could calm Escobar when rage threatened to boil over. And then there was Fabio, the youngest. Restless, bold, the one who still carried the fire of youth, a hunger to prove himself beyond the shadow of his older brothers. He was more reckless, more daring, and, at times, more dangerous because of it. If Jorge Luis was the anchor and Juan David the diplomat, Fabio was the spark. He embraced risk in ways his brothers avoided, sometimes stepping too close to the edge. Together, they balanced one another. Where Escobar was a single force of will, the Ochoas were a trinity. Each brother had a role. Each role was essential, and together they created something Escobar could not create alone: stability. It was not long before their operations grew sophisticated. The Ochoas oversaw smuggling routes that stretched from Colombia's jungles to the coastlines of Florida. They invested in planes, pilots, and networks that could move product with efficiency that rivaled legal trade. To them, cocaine was not chaos. It was logistics, like cattle being herded, like horses being bred. Each shipment had to be planned, each risk measured, each profit tallied. But even as they calculated, danger followed. Every successful shipment was another reason for rivals to target them, another reason for law enforcement to close in. And in Colombia, danger did not only come from police. It came from guerrilla groups, hungry for ransom money. It came from enemies in Miami, ready to gun down competitors in broad daylight. It came from within their own circle, where loyalty was often a fragile illusion. The brothers learned quickly that money was not enough. Survival depended on influence. Bribes became routine. Judges and police bought and sold like cattle in auction. Corruption became their shield. And for a time, that shield held strong. But money cannot shield them from fear. Imagine lying in bed at night, the silence of the ranch around you, and wondering if the shadows outside were just trees in the wind or men waiting with guns. Imagine sending your children to school, never certain if they would return. Every deal, every shipment, every handshake carried the possibility of betrayal. And yet, they moved forward, because the profits were unlike anything Colombia had ever seen. In a single week, they could earn what their father had built in decades of honest ranching. Dollars stacked in mountains, warehouses filled with cash that could not even be counted. And money became both their lifeline and their curse. The Ochoas' homes became fortresses, guards of the gates, cars with bulletproof glass. Ranches that once rang with the sound of horses now echoed with the click of rifles. Yet behind the walls, they still try to hold on to normalcy. Family dinners, horse shows, birthdays, the illusion that they were still the respectable Ochoas, not cartel kings. But the illusion thinned with every passing year. And in the middle of it all was Escobar. Charismatic, ruthless, unpredictable. He was the face of the cartel, the man who wanted to be remembered as both a criminal and a savior. The Ochoas stood beside him, providing the structure he needed. But, deep down, they must have known the danger of being tethered to a man who lived for chaos. Escobar believed in terror. The Ochoas believed in business. It was a partnership built on necessity, but one that would always carry tension. Still, in those early days, it worked. Escobar brought fear. The Ochoas brought order. Together, they created the Medellin Cartel. And soon, the cartel was no longer just a group of smugglers. It was an empire. By the end of the 70s, the Ochoas had moved from quiet partners to indispensable leaders. Each brother's role was clear. Jorge Luis managed the cartel's finances and international negotiations. Juan David handled connections in Miami, smoothing over conflicts with a smile and a handshake. Fabio oversaw risky shipments, pushing boundaries, daring the cartel to grow faster. It was a division of power that worked, but also one that carried cracks. Because no matter how careful Jorge Luis was, no matter how diplomatic Juan David could be, Fabio's recklessness threatened to ignite fires they could not contain. And Escobar's growing hunger for violence meant those fires were never far away. Still, in those years, the Ochoas thrived. Their wealth grew beyond imagination. Their influence seeped into every corner of Medellin. They were not the loudest voices, not the most feared. But behind the curtain, they were pulling strings. And in many ways, they were the reason the cartel held together at all. Imagine the cartel as a machine. Escobar was the engine, roaring, violent, unstoppable. But the Ochoas were the gears. Quiet, precise, turning into shadows, making sure the engine did not tear itself apart. Without the gears, the machine would fail. But no machine runs forever. The more power they gained, the more vulnerable they became. Rivals circled, law enforcement grew sharper, and Escobar's recklessness drew more attention than ever before. The Ochoas tried to stay measured, to keep the business alive while avoiding the spotlight. But their names were already being whispered in the halls of power, both in Colombia and in Washington. And whispers have a way of becoming shouts. In the years to come, their roles would not just define their survival. They would determine the fate of the Medellin Cartel itself. Because when Escobar's empire began to crumble, it would be the Ochoas' choices that decided who lived and who died. But in the late 70s, none of that was clear. The brothers were still rising, still building, still believing they could balance respectability with the underworld, still telling themselves they were businessmen, not killers, still clinging to the idea that they could control the chaos they had stepped into. They could not have known how quickly the chaos would consume them, because the next chapter of their story would not be about horses or ranches. It would not be about family dinners or quiet negotiations. It would be about blood, about violence spilling into their world whether they wanted it or not. And once the blood began to flow, there would be no turning back. The first time the Ochoa brothers sat across from Pablo Escobar, it was not the meeting of gangsters that popular culture imagines. There were no guns on the table, no shouts, no threats. It was quiet, businesslike, almost polite. And yet, in that silence, history shifted. Because from that table, in that room, a partnership was born that would change not only Colombia, but the world. By the late 1970s, the Ochoas were already moving cocaine with a precision that impressed even their rivals. They had routes, they had planes, and they had the money to keep the right people quiet. But ambition is a fire that always spreads, and there's needed fuel. Escobar was that fuel. He had the vision, the ruthlessness, the willingness to do what others would not. The Ochoas had the structure. Together, they could turn a profitable business into an empire. Imagine Escobar entering the room. Stocky, intense, eyes sharp with the hunger of a man who has clawed his way up from nothing. He carried himself like someone who already believed he was destined to rule. But he also knew he needed allies. Alone, he was fire without form. With the Ochoas, he could be a storm. The brothers studied him carefully. Jorge Luis, calm and measured, listened more than he spoke. Juan David, ever the diplomat, tested Escobar with questions, probing for weakness, gauging his reliability. Fabio, restless and eager, admired Escobar's boldness, the way he seemed to defy fear. They did not see a thug. They saw a partner. Escobar's reputation was already growing. He was known in Medellin as a man willing to kill to protect his shipments, a man who bribed police with one hand and threatened them with the other. Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. It was a phrase whispered with dread, and it meant exactly what it sounded like. Take the bribe, or take the bullet. The Ochoas understood what that meant. Escobar's methods were brutal, but they worked. And in the underworld, results mattered more than morality. So they shook hands. And in that handshake, the Medellin Cartel was born. Not officially, not with a name or a charter, but in spirit. It was the moment when businessmen and brute force combined. The Ochoas would provide the skeleton. Escobar would be the muscle. And together, they would move more cocaine than the world had ever seen. At first, it was just business. Escobar brought in suppliers, contacts in Peru and Bolivia, who could provide steady streams of coca paste. The Ochoas oversaw transport, making sure the product flowed smoothly into Colombia, processed in labs hidden deep in the jungle. and shipped north to Miami. Planes were loaded with cocaine in hidden airstrips. Boats carried it across Caribbean waters, and bribes greased the palms of officials on both sides of the border. But cocaine is not like cattle. It cannot be herded quietly. Each shipment carried with it more money than entire towns would see in a lifetime. Each deal invited greed, envy, betrayal. The profits were intoxicating, but they also drew eyes from rivals, from law enforcement, from the state itself. The Ochoas knew this, and perhaps they believed Escobar's ruthlessness would protect them. And for a while it did. When enemies threatened, Escobar responded with violence so swift, so merciless, that few dared cross him twice. When politicians raised their voices against cocaine traffickers, they found themselves silenced, either with bribes that padded their pockets or bullets that ended their lives. Escobar was more than just a partner. He was a shield, a weapon the Ochoas could wield without getting their own hands dirty. But violence has a cost. For every enemy eliminated, 10 more rose in fear and anger. For every official bribed, another demanded more. And slowly, the partnership that seemed unshakable revealed its cracks. The Ochoas had always valued discretion. Escobar craved dominance. They wanted to build quietly. He wanted to conquer loudly. Still, in those early days, the partnership thrived. Miami was flooded with cocaine, so much that it reshaped entire neighborhoods. Fortunes were made overnight. Dealers flaunted gold chains, drove sports cars, and turned violence into a spectacle. The city became a battlefield, and the Medellin Cartel was its invisible general. Behind the chaos, the Ochoas remained shadows. They let Escobar take the spotlight, let him be the one newspapers and police spoke about. It was a dangerous gamble, but also a clever one. So long as Escobar was the face, they could remain the skeleton. And when the time came, they could vanish back into silence, leaving him to carry the weight of infamy. But not yet. In the late 70s, the Ochoas were still climbing. They were building labs, recruiting pilots, negotiating with partners in Miami. They were businessmen in every sense, treating cocaine as though it were another commodity, another product to be moved and sold. Escobar's brutality ensured the business survived. Their structure ensured it thrived. And the money poured in. Imagine warehouses filled with stacks of cash, so much that counting it became impossible. Money had to be weighed, not counted, because there were simply too many bills. It was wealth beyond imagination, wealth that corrupted everything it touched. Police, judges, politicians, all bent beneath the weight of it. Medellin itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of cocaine money. But beneath the surface, fear lingered. Every deal could be a setup. Every smile could hide betrayal. The brothers carried themselves with calm, but inside, they must have felt the tension. Escobar was a powerful partner, but he was also unpredictable. His violence protected them, but it also put them at risk. Perhaps they told themselves they could control him, that their respectability, their wealth, their careful planning could keep him from burning everything down. But Escobar was not a man who could be controlled. He was fire, and fire only knows how to spread. Still, they stayed with him, because in that moment, the partnership worked. It made them kings, and the world was beginning to notice. American authorities were watching Miami, horrified by the sudden explosion of violence and cocaine on their streets. Colombian officials, many already bought, looked the other way, but even they could not ignore the growing influence of traffickers. Whispers of the Medellin Mafia spread, whispers that would soon solidify into a name the world would never forget: the Medellin Cartel. The Ochoas had entered the underworld cautiously, believing they could balance respectability with risk. But now, with Escobar at their side, there was no going back. They were part of something larger, something that would consume Colombia itself. And as the empire grew, so too did the dangers. Rivals plotted. Guerrillas hunted for ransom. The state prepared to act. And in the center of it all, the Ochoas stood beside a man whose ambition knew no limits. It was a partnership that promised riches beyond imagination. But it was also a partnership that carried a question no one could yet answer. Would the Ochoas' caution save them from Escobar's fire? Or would his fire consume them too? The moment the Medellin Cartel was born, it was not announced with trumpets or declarations. It was not a formal alliance etched into documents or sealed with signatures. It happened in a quiet room, away from cameras and headlines, when men who had tasted the first sweetness of cocaine money realized they could no longer afford to move separately. Alone, they were strong. Together, they would be unstoppable. It was the late 1970s, and Colombia was changing. Cocaine was no longer a whisper in the underworld. It was a roar spreading across Miami, transforming it from a sunny beach town into the cocaine capital of the world. American demand was insatiable, and the money pouring in was like nothing anyone had ever seen. It could buy cars, planes, mansions, but more importantly, it could buy power. And in Colombia, power meant survival. The traffickers understood this. They knew that standing alone made them vulnerable. Rivals could strike. Police could target them. Guerrillas could kidnap their families. But together, they could pool resources, share networks, and present a united front against enemies. The Ochoa brothers understood it more than most, and Pablo Escobar, hungry for dominance, was ready to lead it. Picture the gathering. Cigarette smoke hanging in the air, men leaning back in chairs, voices low, deals being whispered into the night. Jorge Luis Ochoa, calm and composed, spoke like a banker, weighing risks and profits. Juan David leaned forward, his words smooth, charming, building bridges between men who might otherwise be rivals. Fabio, restless, tapped his fingers on the table, eager for expansion, for movement, for more. Across from them sat Escobar, stocky and intense, his eyes burning with ambition. Around them, other names that would one day be infamous: Carlos Letter, Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, Jose Gonzalo Mejia. Each man brought something to the table: money, networks, routes, or firepower. It was not friendship that bound them. It was necessity. Like wolves circling the same prey, they realized that fighting each other would only weaken them. But, united, they could feast together. The Ochoas brought legitimacy. Their wealth and ranching background gave the cartel a veneer of respectability. They could mingle with politicians, attend equestrian events, shake hands in public without raising suspicion. Escobar brought fear. His willingness to bribe or kill made him the enforcer, the man whose very name became a weapon. Letter brought innovation, turning Norman's Cay in the Bahamas into a smuggling hub that became the cartel's lifeline into Miami. Gacha, known as El Mexicano, brought brutal efficiency and an army of killers. Together, these men built something the world had never seen before. The structure was simple but effective. Escobar was the face, the man who would terrify enemies and inspire loyalty through fear. The Ochoas were the businessmen, the ones who balanced the books, kept the money flowing, and maintained the cartel's backbone. Letter was the visionary smuggler, building bridges across oceans. Gacha was the hammer, crushing resistance wherever it appeared. Each had a role. Each role was essential. And the money, it was endless. By the early 1980s, the cartel was moving tons of cocaine every month. Planes left Colombia daily, packed with shipments that would fetch fortunes in the United States. Boats slipped across Caribbean waters, their holds filled with powder. Couriers carried cash back by the millions. The profits were so immense that counting became impossible. They weighed money instead of counting it, because the stacks of bills were too high to tally by hand. But money does not only buy luxury. It buys power. It bought police officers who turned their eyes away. It bought politicians who spoke in favor of traffickers. It bought judges who dismissed charges, prosecutors who lost evidence, and generals who redirected soldiers. With every dollar, the cartel wrapped its hands tighter around Colombia's throat. For the Ochoas, this was both triumph and terror. They had stepped fully into a world that no longer allowed them to balance respectability and crime. They were cartel leaders now, their names whispered alongside Escobar's in backrooms and police reports. Their fathers' horses still won trophies, But those trophies were now financed by cocaine. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. And yet, they remained cautious. Where Escobar courted attention, flaunting his wealth with zoos and soccer teams, the Ochoas tried to keep a lower profile. They moved quietly, investing in businesses, blending cocaine profits with legitimate ventures. They still carried themselves as gentlemen, not gangsters. But no matter how polite their smiles, they were bound to the blood Escobar spilled. Because Escobar's method was simple: Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe, or take the bullet. It was effective, but it dragged the entire cartel into war with the Colombian state. Judges were assassinated. Politicians were bombed. Police officers were gunned down in the streets. Each act of violence tightened the noose around the cartel, but it also tightened Escobar's grip. The Ochoas saw the danger. They knew that violence invited enemies, that every explosion brought more attention from the United States, more pressure from Colombian authorities. But they also knew Escobar could not be stopped. He was not just their partner. He was their shield, their sword, their fire. Without him, the cartel would fracture. With him, it was invincible. For a time. Still, the alliance was uneasy. Escobar thrived on chaos. The Ochoas thrived on order. Together, they built an empire, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The Medellin Cartel was not a corporation in the way legitimate businesses are. It was more like a medieval kingdom. Escobar was the warlord, feared and obeyed, his word often final. The Ochoas were his noblemen, wealthy and respected, but always wary of their king's temper. Letter was the eccentric visionary, valuable but unpredictable. Gotcha was the executioner, ruthless and loyal, until loyalty no longer served him. Each man trusted the others only as far as profits demanded. And in the underworld, profit is a bond as fragile as glass. But for the moment, it worked. Together, they controlled the majority of cocaine flowing into the United States. Together, they turned Medellin from a city into a global symbol of drug power. Together, they built the most feared criminal organization of its time. And the Ochoas remained in the shadows, where they preferred to be. Escobar's name filled the newspapers, his face plastered across wanted posters. He became the symbol of the cocaine boom, the villain in every headline. The Ochoas stayed quiet, their influence hidden behind the noise. They allowed Escobar to take the blame, the glory, and the heat. And in doing so, they ensured their survival. But shadows cannot hide forever. As the cartel grew, so too did the dangers. The United States was no longer blind to what was happening. The DEA, the FBI, and U.S. Customs began focusing on Medellin. They pressured Colombia to act, demanding extradition treaties, demanding that traffickers face American courts. For Escobar, extradition was a nightmare, a fate worse than death. For the Ochoas, it was a storm on the horizon they could not ignore. And in that storm, one question lingered. Could the cartel survive its own success? Could the men who had built it, businessmen, killers, visionaries, and warlords, continue to stand together when the world was closing in on them? The Medellin Cartel had been born in whispers and handshakes, built on money and fear. It had risen to dominate a nation and flood another. But empires are fragile things. They rise fast, they shine bright, and too often they burn out. The Ochoa brothers had built the skeleton. Escobar had given it muscle. Together, they had created a monster. But what happens when a monster can no longer be controlled? A horse trailer rolled down a quiet Colombian road, its wheels rattling against the dirt. To anyone watching, it looked ordinary, just another wealthy rancher moving prize stallions from one ranch to another. The Ochoas had been doing it for years. Horses were their family pride, their father's legacy, their ticket into the respectable circles of Colombia's elite. But hidden among the saddles, beneath the hay and the polished tack, was something far more valuable than horses. It was cocaine, and it was headed north. This was the genius of the Ochoa brothers. They understood that the best smuggling routes were the ones nobody questioned. Horses, cattle, ranch supplies, all legitimate, all part of their family name. To police, to customs officials, they were gentlemen breeders, not traffickers. Their animals traveled the world for competitions. Their ranches opened doors that most smugglers could never dream of walking through. And so cocaine slipped quietly through, shielded by respectability. But horses were just the beginning. The Ochoas built a network so vast and so intricate that it rivaled the logistical chains of legitimate multinational corporations. To move cocaine from jungle labs in Colombia to buyers in Miami required precision. It was not chaos. It was choreography. Small planes lifted off from hidden runways, packed with cocaine wrapped in waterproof bundles. Some landed in the Bahamas, where allies like Carlos Leder turned entire islands into smuggling hubs. Others flew low over the Caribbean, dropping shipments into the sea where speedboats waited to scoop them up. Boats carried product disguised as fishing hauls. Cargo ships slipped it between crates. Even commercial flights carried packages tucked into luggage. The methods changed constantly, but the principle remained the same. Keep the product moving, keep the money flowing. Miami was the beating heart of this network. What New York was to Wall Street, Miami became to cocaine. Shipments arrived daily, flooding the city's streets, feeding the insatiable demand of the late 1970s and early 80s. The profits were astronomical. A kilo bought in Colombia for a few $1,000s could sell in Miami for more than 10 times that amount. Multiply that by tons, and the numbers became staggering, hundreds of millions flowing back every month. The Ochoas were not the ones firing guns in Miami's bloody drug wars. They were not the ones gunned down in broad daylight outside shopping malls. They stayed in Colombia, far from the chaos, letting others fight for territory while they kept the arteries of the trade open. They were the bankers, the logisticians, the quiet masterminds. And because of that, they survived where others did not. But survival did not mean safety. Every shipment carried risk. A plane could be intercepted. A pilot could flip. A shipment could vanish at sea. And with so much money at stake, betrayal was inevitable. The Ochoas had to navigate a world where trust was as fragile as glass. They paid pilots handsomely, but they also reminded them of the consequences of betrayal. Loyalty was enforced with both silver and lead. Their family ranches became command centers. To outsiders, they looked like places of leisure, rolling pastures, stables filled with champions, parties where Colombia's elite mingled. But behind closed doors, deals were struck. Routes were mapped. Cash was counted. Horses grazed in the fields while cocaine shipments were planned in the rooms above. It was this duality that defined the Ochoas. Gentlemen in public, traffickers in private. They walked both worlds with ease, never raising suspicion until it was too late. Miami, however, was not a place of quiet business. It was a war zone. As cocaine flooded the city, rival gangs fought for control. Shootouts erupted in broad daylight, bodies piled up, and morgues overflowed. Newspapers called it the cocaine cowboy era. The Ochoas watched from a distance, their profits growing even as the violence spiraled. They had chosen their role carefully, not street enforcers, not local dealers, but suppliers. Let others shed blood. They would count the money. And yet, the violence touched them all the same. Every death in Miami drew more attention from American law enforcement. Every newspaper headline about cocaine killings brought more pressure on Colombia to act. The Ochoas wanted discretion. Escobar wanted domination. Their smuggling network depended on silence, but Escobar's bombs and bullets made silence impossible. Still, the system worked. For years, it worked better than anyone could have imagined. By the early 80s, the Medellin Cartel controlled the majority of cocaine flowing into the United States. And at the center of that machine were the Ochoa brothers, their network stretching from Colombian ranches to American nightclubs. But building such a network meant trusting many hands. Pilots, fishermen, dock workers, corrupt officials. Every link in the chain was a potential weakness. The brothers had to balance fear and loyalty constantly. Too much fear, and workers fled. Too much trust, and shipments disappeared. It was a delicate dance, and one mistake could unravel everything. The profits, though, drown out doubt. Imagine money stacked so high it filled entire rooms, cash counted by the ton, hidden in walls, buried in fields, stuffed into suitcases. The Ochoas swam in wealth beyond imagination. They bought properties, businesses, horses worth fortunes. But wealth became a curse too. How do you hide billions? How do you spend money when everyone knows no legal business could earn that much? The more they had, the more attention they risked. And in Colombia, attention was dangerous. Guerrilla groups like M19 saw traffickers as targets for kidnapping. Leftist rebels demanded ransom, threatening families, storming ranches. For the Ochoas, every day was a calculation. How to move cocaine, how to hide money, how to protect loved ones. Success brought fear as much as it brought comfort. Yet through it all, the brothers held steady. Jorge Luis remained cautious, balancing books and minimizing risk. Juan David smoothed over disputes, negotiating with allies and rivals alike. Fabio pushed forward recklessly, eager to expand routes, to outpace everyone else. Together, they kept the network alive, the machine humming, even as the world began to close in. For American law enforcement, the Ochoas were shadows. Escobar was the headline. Escobar was the villain. But behind the explosions, behind the assassinations, it was the Ochoas' network feeding the cocaine epidemic. They were the skeleton beneath the monster, the invisible gears turning while Escobar roared. But shadows cannot remain forever. Whispers began to surface. The DA started hearing the name Ochoa. Colombian officials began connecting the family's wealth to the booming drug trade. Rivals in Miami knew who supplied the cocaine that fueled their wars. The brothers' network was vast, but its size made it impossible to keep hidden. And with every successful shipment, the danger grew. The Medellin Cartel was no longer just an alliance. It was an empire, and empires make enemies. The Ochoas had built their smuggling network with precision, using horses, ranches, and Miami connections to flood the United States with cocaine. But in doing so, they had painted a target on their backs. Rivals wanted their routes. Guerrillas wanted their ransom. Governments wanted their heads. The machine was working. The money was flowing. The empire was rising. But how long could it last before the weight of it all came crashing down? The car exploded without warning. 1 second it was parked in a quiet Medellin street. The next it was a fireball, shards of metal cutting through the air, glass shattering in 1,000 directions. The flames rose higher than the rooftops. People screamed. Sirens wailed. Blood and smoke filled the air. And in that moment, the world of the Medellin Cartel changed forever. Violence had arrived. Up to this point, the Ochoa brothers had built their empire with precision. Their smuggling network was a machine of logistics, quiet and efficient. They preferred business to bloodshed, money to mayhem. Violence, to them, was bad for business. It drew attention. It made enemies. It left trails. But for Pablo Escobar, violence was not just a tool. It was language. It was power. And once he began to speak it loudly, no one in Colombia could ignore him. Escobar's philosophy was simple. Plata o Plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. And he lived it with every breath. Judges who threatened extradition were gunned down. Journalists who exposed the cartel were murdered in broad daylight. Politicians who stood against him were bombed, their families threatened until silence became their only option. Escobar saw fear as currency, and he spent it recklessly. The Ochoas watched uneasily. They had partnered with Escobar because of his ambition, his network, his sheer will to dominate. But now, that same ambition was turning into fire. Every act of violence that protected the cartel also invited retaliation. Every explosion that silenced an enemy also drew the full attention of the Colombian government. Escobar was transforming business into war, and the brothers were caught in the middle. Jorge Luis felt the weight most heavily. As the eldest, he saw the long game, the risks that violence brought. He wanted stability, to keep the machine running quietly in the shadows. Juan David, ever the diplomat, tried to smooth things over, reassuring allies, calming nerves, pretending that the violence was only temporary. Fabio, young and reckless, admired Escobar's boldness at first, thrilled by the fear it inspired. But even he began to realize that Escobar's path was not one that ended in survival. Because violence has a gravity of its own. Once it begins, it pulls everything into its orbit. Rivals retaliate, governments react, allies fracture, and soon, the cartel was no longer just about cocaine. It was about survival in a war that no one had asked for. The bombs in Medellin marked a turning point. No longer could the cartel pretend to be a business operating in the shadows. It was now an army, openly defying the Colombian state. Escobar relished it. He wanted to be remembered as a man who could bring a nation to its knees. The Ochoas, however, recoiled. They did not want their names in headlines. They did not want their family ranches to become targets. They wanted profit, not infamy. But once Escobar lit the fire, there was no extinguishing it. The violence spread across Colombia like a plague. Police were hunted in the streets, their bodies left as warnings. Judges were assassinated, one after another. Even civilians were not spared when bombs tore through crowded neighborhoods. Fear became the backdrop of daily life in Medellin. For the Ochoas, it was a nightmare. Their network depended on discretion, on the ability to move product without drawing eyes. Now, every eye in the world was fixed on Medellin. American law enforcement intensified their efforts, pressuring Colombia to crack down. The Colombian state, once pliable under bribes, began to feel the strain of public outrage. Escobar's violence was not just destabilizing the government. It was destabilizing the cartel itself. And yet, they could not simply walk away. Their fortunes were tied to Escobar's war, whether they liked it or not. They had built the skeleton of the empire, and Escobar had clothed it in muscle. But now that muscle was lashing out uncontrollably, and the skeleton could do nothing to stop it. The Ochoas faced impossible choices. To oppose Escobar outright was suicide. To follow him blindly was ruin. So they tried to walk a thin line, supporting him enough to maintain unity, but distancing themselves where they could. They negotiated quietly with officials, used their influence to protect their families, and prayed that Escobar's fury would not burn them along with everyone else. But violence has a way of infecting even those who resist it. Soon, the Ochoas themselves were drawn into it. Guerrilla groups targeted their family, kidnapping relatives, demanding ransom. Rivals plotted against them, emboldened by the chaos Escobar unleashed. Even within the cartel, paranoia grew. Who could be trusted? Who might betray them to the government? Who might strike first to save themselves? The brothers were no strangers to fear now. Nights were sleepless. Days were shadowed by the presence of bodyguards. Children were sent away, hidden, protected as best as they could be. Every knock on the door could be the start of an ambush. Every phone call could be a death sentence. This was not the life they had imagined when they first smuggled cocaine hidden among horses. They had wanted wealth, power, comfort. What they now had was war. And Escobar thrived in it. He grew bolder with every act of terror, convinced that fear could shield him forever. But the Ochoas saw what he refused to admit. Fear also created enemies who would never rest until he was destroyed. Perhaps, deep down, the brothers began to regret the partnership. They had once believed Escobar's fire would protect them. Now they realized it might consume them. But regret could not undo what had been done. They were bound together, their names inseparable from his in the eyes of the world. The violence also changed the rules of business. Deals that had once been struck with handshakes and bribes were now enforced with bullets. Allies who once smiled across tables now carried weapons beneath their coats. The cartel was no longer a business. It was a battlefield disguised as one. Still, the Ochoas endured. They adapted. Jorge Luis tightened control over finances, ensuring money kept flowing even as chaos spread. Juan David worked tirelessly to keep negotiations alive, convincing allies that the cartel could still function despite the bloodshed. Fabio, reckless as ever, sometimes leaned into the violence, seeing it as unavoidable, even necessary. But even he knew that Escobar's path was unsustainable. And yet, Escobar could not stop. His war with the Colombian state deepened. The United States increased pressure, demanding extradition. Escobar responded with more bombs, more assassinations. And with each act, the world turned further against him. The Ochoas were trapped. Their preference for business was irrelevant now. Violence had become the language of the cartel, and silence was complicity. They could not distance themselves without risking death. They could not embrace it without risking destruction. So they walked the razor's edge, praying for balance in a world where balance was impossible. And then came the moment that changed everything. A kidnapping, a murder, a line crossed so violently that even the Ochoas could no longer pretend they could stay in the shadows. The question was no longer how much money they could make. It was how long they could survive. A grocery store parking lot, shoppers pushing carts, children tugging at their parents' hands, the Florida sun burning bright above. And then, gunfire, dozens of shots ripping through the air, a car riddled with bullets, bodies slumped over the steering wheel. It was broad daylight, ordinary people screaming and ducking for cover. This was not Colombia. This was Miami, and it was the new front line of the cocaine wars. By the early 1980s, the Medellin Cartel's cocaine pipeline had turned Miami into a city drowning in powder. Shipments from Colombia poured in daily, flooding neighborhoods, clubs, and streets. The Ochoa brothers' smuggling network fed the flow, their routes so efficient that Miami became less of a city and more of a cocaine gateway. But with money came violence, and soon the city was soaked in blood. The Ochoas themselves were not in Miami, not pulling triggers on street corners. They remained in Colombia, orchestrating from afar. But their product, their decisions, their empire fueled the chaos. Every kilo they moved into the United States became another spark in Miami's firestorm. And soon, the fire consumed the city. Imagine the streets of Little Havana at night. Neon lights from bars flickering. Cars parked bumper to bumper. Inside, deals were made in whispers, stacks of cash traded for tightly wrapped packages. Outside, men with guns lingered in shadows, ready to strike if a deal went wrong. The violence was not random. It was business. Every killing was a message, every corpse a warning. Miami newspapers called it the cocaine cowboy era. Shootouts erupted in broad daylight. Gunmen stormed hotels. Bodies were dumped on highways. The morgues overflowed. Hospitals saw waves of gunshot victims. For ordinary people, fear became part of daily life. A trip to the store, a stop at a red light, a night at a club, all could end in blood. Behind the chaos were Colombian suppliers, and at the core of those suppliers were the Ochoa brothers. Their cocaine fed the city's appetite. They were not the ones holding guns in Miami, but without their shipments, without their network, there would have been no war. And the profits were staggering. Each kilo moved through Miami multiplied the brothers' wealth tenfold. Money poured back into Colombia, mountains of cash so vast that it could not be laundered fast enough. Homes, businesses, horses, ranches, all became vessels to absorb the fortune. But the more money flowed, the more violent Miami became. Law enforcement in the United States was overwhelmed. The Drug Enforcement Administration, Miami police, customs officials, none had ever seen anything like it. Cocaine was flooding in faster than they could seize it. For every shipment caught, 10 more slipped through. For every trafficker arrested, 3 more rose to take his place. It was a losing battle, and the Ochoas knew it. They also knew that Miami's violence was bad for business. The bloodshed drew headlines. Headlines drew attention, and attention brought heat. The brothers preferred silence, profit without spectacle. But once Escobar and others pushed harder into Miami, silence became impossible. Still, the Ochoas adapted. They forged alliances with distributors who controlled Miami's streets, handing off product in bulk and letting others take the risks of street-level violence. To them, Miami was a marketplace, not a battlefield. But markets collapse when wars rage, and soon, the violence threatened even their profits. The killings were brutal. Entire families wiped out. Rivals executed in shopping malls. Hotels turned into crime scenes. The violence was not just between gangs. It spilled into everyday life. Tourists, children, bystanders, all became collateral damage. Miami's glittering image of beaches and nightlife was stained with blood. And as bodies piled up, American politicians took notice. Pressure mounted on Colombia to act. The word Medellin was no longer just a city. It was a symbol of terror, synonymous with cocaine and death. The Ochoas, though still in the shadows, were tied to that symbol. Their names were whispered in DEA reports, their wealth quietly noted by investigators. They had avoided headlines, but in law enforcement circles, their role was no secret. For the Ochoas, the dilemma deepened. They wanted business, not war. But business itself was fueling war. Their shipments made Miami rich, but also made it bleed. Their profits grew, but so did the bodies. And the more the violence raged, the closer the United States looked at Colombia, demanding extradition treaties, demanding that traffickers face American courts. Extradition. That single word was enough to chill traffickers' blood. To be extradited to the United States meant trials, prisons, life sentences without the luxury or corruption of Colombia. For Escobar, it was worse than death. For the Ochoas, it was the storm they had always feared. And Miami's bloodshed made that storm inevitable. Jorge Luis worried most. His cautious nature saw the danger clearly. Every gunshot in Miami was a nail in the coffin of their discretion. Juan David worked to maintain relationships, to calm allies, to convince partners that profits would survive the chaos. Fabio, reckless as always, still believed in the money, still pushed for more shipments, more routes, more expansion. But even he could not deny the cost of the war. And yet they could not stop. The machine was too big, the demand too high, the profits too intoxicating. Even as Miami burned, the Ochoas kept the cocaine flowing. Imagine the irony. In Colombia, they were still respected landowners, attending horse shows, hosting dinners. In Miami, their cocaine was turning streets into war zones. Two worlds, two faces, one empire. But the empire was not invincible. Miami's bloodshed united American law enforcement in a way nothing else had. Task forces were created, new laws passed, budgets expanded. The war on drugs became a rallying cry, and Medellin was enemy number one. Escobar was the target, but the Ochoas were part of the net being cast. The question now was not whether the violence would end. It was how much of Colombia would burn before it did. The Ochoas had built a network to move cocaine like cattle, quietly, efficiently. But Miami had turned it into a slaughterhouse. And with every body that fell on Florida streets, the brothers knew their empire was growing more fragile. How long could business survive when war had already consumed it? The call came like a knife through the quiet of a family evening. A voice, cold and steady, demanding ransom. Martha Ochoa's fiancé had been taken. Not by rivals, not by police, but by the M19 guerrilla movement, a leftist group that had grown bold enough to kidnap the loved ones of Colombia's wealthiest families. For the Ochoas, it was more than a crime. It was a declaration of war. The M19 had risen in the 70s as self-styled revolutionaries, armed students and radicals who claimed to fight for justice against Colombia's elite. To fund their movement, they turned to kidnappings. Businessmen, landowners, politicians, anyone with money became a target. Ransom payments filled their coffers, and fear spread like wildfire. But when they touched the Ochoa family, they made a mistake that would echo across Colombia for years. Martha Ochoa was not just any woman. She was the sister of Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio, the three men who, alongside Escobar, had built the Medellin Cartel into a machine of power and wealth. Her fiancé, taken by masked men, was a direct line to the brothers' pride, their honor, their blood. And in Colombia, blood demanded vengeance. The kidnappers believed money would buy safety. They were wrong. The Ochoas did not negotiate. They did not plead. They gathered. They called upon allies, rivals, anyone touched by the same threat. And, together, They created something new, something more dangerous than the cartel itself. They called it MAS, Muerte a Sequestradores, death to kidnappers. It was not an empty name. MAS became a paramilitary force, funded by the cartel's fortune, armed with military-grade weapons, trained with the kind of discipline usually reserved for armies. Hundreds of men joined, many of them former soldiers, policemen, or mercenaries hungry for money and blood. The Ochoas gave them a mission: find the kidnappers, kill them, and make sure no one in Colombia would ever dare target cartel families again. The violence was swift and merciless. Suspected guerrillas were hunted down, dragged from their homes, executed in the streets. Safe houses were raided, bodies left behind as warnings. MAS did not care for trials or evidence. If you were suspected of kidnapping, you were as good as dead. Fear spread faster than the guerrillas had ever managed to spread it themselves. For the Ochoas, it was personal. Every night they thought of Martha, of her fiancé held captive, tortured, pleading for his life. The M-19 had crossed a line deeper than money. They had made it family, and family was something the brothers protected with everything they had. But the story did not end in triumph. Despite the campaign of terror MAS unleashed, Martha's fiancé was killed. His body was found, lifeless, discarded like trash. For the Ochoas, grief turned to rage. The movement they had created out of vengeance did not bring him back, but it had reshaped Colombia forever. MAS became more than just a response to a kidnapping. It became a symbol of the cartel's willingness to act like a state within a state. It was not just about protecting their own families. It was about control, about showing Colombia's guerrillas that traffickers were not prey. They were predators, and predators did not negotiate with kidnappers. They exterminated them. The Colombian government, ironically, found itself both horrified and relieved. Horrified by the brutality of MAS, relieved that someone was fighting back against the guerrillas they had struggled to contain. In whispers, in corridors of power, some even looked the other way. The traffickers had done what the state could not. They had made the guerrillas afraid. For the Ochoas, MAS revealed something more profound. Violence was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. They had tried to remain businessmen, to keep their empire cloaked in logistics and profit. But the kidnapping had pulled them into a world where survival demanded blood. It was not a world they wanted, but it was one they could no longer avoid. Escobar, of course, thrived in this environment. To him, MAS was proof that fear worked, that violence was not a weakness but strength. But the Ochoas saw it differently. To them, MAS was not glory. It was tragedy. It was the reminder that even their wealth, their influence, their careful planning could not protect the people they loved. Martha, shattered by grief, carried the weight of her fiancé's death. Her brothers carried it too, though in silence. Every time they counted money, every time they planned shipments, they knew it was stained with his blood. It made them harder, colder, more determined to survive. But it also planted seeds of doubt. If the cartel's power could not protect family, then what was it really worth? Still, MAS continued. What began as vengeance evolved into something larger, a paramilitary network that outlived its original purpose. It became a tool not only against kidnappers, but against anyone who threatened the cartel. Informants, rivals, enemies of convenience. Once violence begins, it rarely stops where it was meant to. Colombia became a place where shadows ruled. Guerrillas feared traffickers. Citizens feared both. The state struggled to maintain control, caught between rebels and cartels, often corrupted or overpowered by both. And at the center of it all, the Ochoa brothers watched as their private tragedy became public terror. The kidnapping of Martha's fiancé had been a single act, but its consequences rippled outward, reshaping the underworld. It hardened the brothers, binding them closer to Escobar's violent world, even as they resisted it. It blurred the line between business and war, between profit and blood. It showed them that their empire was not untouchable, that enemies could reach even into their homes. And it left them with a haunting truth. In Colombia's underworld, no one was safe, not even family. From then on, every deal they made, every shipment they sent, every decision they took, carried the memory of that loss. It whispered to them in the quiet hours, a reminder of what was at stake. Money could buy influence, violence could buy fear, but neither could bring back the dead. And as the Medellin Cartel grew, as Escobar's war with the state escalated, the Ochoas carried that burden. It weighed on Jorge Luis's cautious shoulders. It haunted Juan David's diplomatic smile. It fueled Fabio's restless ambition. But it also carved a deeper divide between them and Escobar. For him, violence was power. For them, violence was pain. And yet, they were bound to him still. Bound to his fire, bound to his fury, bound to a partnership that was leading them into darker and darker places. The murder of Martha's fiancé was not the last act of blood the Ochoas would endure. It was only the beginning. Because once a family learns that even their homes can be invaded, even their loved ones can be stolen, there is no turning back. And soon, the Ochoa brothers would face choices darker than anything they had yet imagined. The night was broken by headlights cutting through the dust. A convoy of trucks rolled into the countryside, men in camouflage spilling out, rifles slung across their shoulders. They moved with precision, faces hard, eyes sharp. They were not police. They were not soldiers. They were something else entirely. They were MAS. Death to kidnappers. A force born not in government halls or military barracks, but in the grief and fury of the Ochoa family. The murder of Martha, Ochoa's fiancée, had lit a fuse. The brothers could not undo his death, but they could make sure no one ever dared to touch their family again. And so they poured money, weapons, and influence into a project that would reshape Colombia's conflict. It began as vengeance, but it became something larger, darker, more permanent. MAS was not subtle. Its name alone was a declaration of intent. Anyone who kidnapped, or even looked like they might, was a target. Guerrillas from M19, petty criminals, suspected informants, all were hunted. The paramilitary squads swept through rural towns, dragging men from their homes, leaving bodies as warnings. Fear spread faster than any ransom note ever had. For the Ochoas, MAS was more than revenge. It was strategy. Kidnapping had always been the cartel's greatest vulnerability. Money could buy influence. Guns could protect shipments. But when guerrillas snatched family members, no amount of cash or power could guarantee safety. MAS changed that. It turned traffickers from prey into predators. It sent a message: kidnap one of us, and you will not live to kidnap another. Colombia had seen violence before, but this was different. This was private justice, cartel-funded paramilitaries taking on the role of the state. And the state, unable or unwilling to stop it, quietly let it happen. Some in government even welcomed it. The guerrillas had been a thorn in their side for years, and now traffickers were doing their dirty work for them. It was an unholy alliance, unspoken but undeniable. On the ground, the results were immediate. Kidnappings dropped sharply. Guerrillas, once bold enough to storm ranches and abduct wealthy heirs, began to hesitate. Families that had lived in fear found a grim kind of protection in MAS shadow. But protection came at a cost. Innocents were swept up in the bloodletting, accused without evidence, executed without trial. MAS was not precise. It was ruthless. The Ochoa brothers watched all of this with a mix of pride and unease. Pride that they had struck back, that they had shown Colombia no one could violate their family without consequence. Unease because they knew what it meant. MAS was not just an answer to kidnapping. It was the cartel stepping fully into the role of a parallel state. They were no longer just businessmen in the shadows. They were warlords shaping Colombia's future. Escobar, predictably, reveled in it. MAS proved his belief that violence was the ultimate weapon. He saw it as validation, proof that fear was stronger than law. For the Ochoas, though, it was heavier. They had not wanted to be drawn so deeply into blood. They had wanted profit, not paramilitary armies. But grief and survival left them no choice. MAS grew quickly. What started as a response to one kidnapping expanded into a nationwide network. Hundreds of men joined, many lured by money, others by ideology. Entire regions fell under their shadow, places where guerrillas once ruled now dominated by cartel-backed paramilitaries. The lines blurred until it was hard to tell where the state ended and MAS began. And with growth came mission creep. MAS was no longer only about kidnapping. It was about control. Rivals found themselves targeted under the pretense of being kidnappers. Communities suspected of sympathizing with guerrillas were punished brutally. It became a catch-all justification for eliminating anyone the cartel considered a threat. Colombia's conflict, already tangled, grew more complicated. Now there were not two sides, the state and the guerrillas. There was a third power, fueled by cocaine, armed to the teeth, willing to use terror to protect its own. MAS had tilted the balance, and no one could ignore it. For the Ochoas, the creation of MAS was both shield and burden. It made them safer, yes, but it also tied them even more tightly to Escobar's world of blood. They could no longer pretend they were merely businessmen. Their money-funded massacres, their decisions shaped violence. Their fingerprints were on every body left behind. Jorge Luis carried the weight with grim resolve. He saw MAS as necessary, but also as a dangerous step deeper into chaos. Juan David used his charm to justify it, framing it as protection, not aggression. Fabio, restless, embraced it more openly, proud that their enemies now feared them. But behind their public faces, all three must have wondered how far this would go. Because once a monster is unleashed, it rarely goes back into its cage. MAS outlived its original purpose. Even after the kidnapping crisis faded, the paramilitaries remained. They became part of Colombia's bloody tapestry, another armed actor in a conflict already soaked in decades of violence. And the Ochoas, whether they wanted it or not, were remembered as the men who had set it loose. For ordinary Colombians, MAS was a double-edged sword. Some saw it as protection, a brutal shield against guerrillas who had terrorized them for years. Others saw it as another predator, just as dangerous as the enemies it claimed to fight. In truth, it was both. To live under MAS was to live in fear, not of being kidnapped, but of being suspected. The Ochoa brothers could not have missed the irony. They had created MAS to protect their family, to shield their loved ones. But in doing so, they had made countless other families live in terror. Their grief had been transformed into a machine that now chewed through lives indiscriminately. And in the quiet hours, when the noise of business faded, perhaps they asked themselves whether they had gone too far. Whether the fiancé's death had not only cost them love, but had dragged them into a spiral they could no longer control. But doubt does not stop history. MAS had been born, and once born, it became part of Colombia's destiny. Escobar's bombs would shake cities. The guerrillas would continue their insurgency. The government would wage its own war. But now, in the shadows, paramilitaries backed by cocaine fortunes stalked the countryside, carrying out massacres in the name of protection. And at the heart of it all was the Ochoa family. Not by choice, but by blood. MAS was their answer to a kidnapping. But it had become Colombia's new nightmare. And as the 80s deepened, the brothers would learn a harder truth. You cannot unleash violence and remain untouched by it. Sooner or later, it circles back. And the question was no longer whether MAS could protect them. It was whether anything could. The phone call came from Madrid. A contact with a heavy accent, speaking fast, eager, almost desperate. Cocaine was not just flooding Miami anymore. It was moving east, slipping quietly into Europe, where demand was beginning to explode. Nightclubs in Spain, in Paris, in Rome, whispered for the powder the same way Miami's clubs once had. The opportunity was clear, and the Ochoa brothers were ready to seize it. The Medellin Cartel had already conquered the Americas. From jungle labs to Miami's bloody streets, the machine worked. But Europe was different. It was a new market, less saturated, less watched, and filled with wealthy customers who paid top dollar for the high. To ignore it would have been madness. To enter would mean expansion beyond anything Colombia had ever seen. The Ochoas had the perfect tools. Their horses, their stables, their connections in Spain. For years, the family had traveled to Europe for equestrian events, mingling with elites, earning respect in circles that had nothing to do with cocaine. That respect became the perfect cover. Behind the elegance of their Paso Fino champions, another business began to grow. Imagine a horse crate arriving at a Spanish airport. Customs officers glance at the paperwork, nodding, barely looking inside. Who would suspect that beneath the straw, hidden in compartments, were kilos of cocaine? The Ochoas used what they knew best. Horses as cover, ranches as staging grounds, respectability as camouflage. But horses were only one piece. Soon, the network expanded. Cargo ships crossing the Atlantic, fishing boats docking quietly in Spanish ports, couriers slipping packages into luggage. Cocaine flowed into Spain, then spread across Europe like ink through water. The profits dwarfed even those from Miami. Prices in Europe were higher, competition was weaker, and law enforcement was less prepared. The Ochoas became the cartel's key link. They were not just smugglers now. They were international businessmen, moving product across oceans, building connections in Spain that turned into pipelines across the continent. From Madrid, shipments reached Paris, London, Milan. From Spain's sunny coastlines, cocaine reached Europe's nightclubs, its high society, its underworld. But expansion carried risks. Every new route was another vulnerability. Every new ally was a potential betrayer. Europe was less violent than Miami, but no less dangerous. Rival traffickers eyed the Colombians with suspicion. Law enforcement, though slower to react, began to take notice. And the brothers had to balance distance with control, ensuring shipments arrived while keeping themselves hidden. Jorge Luis, as always, kept the books balanced. He measured profits against risks, careful not to overextend. Juan David used his charm, building alliances in Spain, navigating unfamiliar cultures with the ease of a diplomat. Fabio, restless, pushed for more, eager to expand faster, to take more of the market before others could. Together, they turned Europe into their second empire. And the money poured in. If Miami had made them rich, Europe made them untouchable. The profits were astronomical, so much that even they struggled to launder it all. Mansions in Spain, businesses in Madrid, properties in the countryside. The Ochoas buried their money in legitimate fronts, blending cocaine cash with horse shows and land deals. To the outside world, they were successful Colombian ranchers investing abroad. To those in the know, they were the pipeline that fed Europe's growing hunger for cocaine. But money and power always come with shadows. Europe's underworld was not the same as Miami's. It was older, more entrenched, with roots in smuggling that stretched back centuries. The Ochoas had to negotiate with established networks, Spanish gangs, Italian mafias, North African smugglers. Each alliance carried risk, each handshake a potential knife in the back. And back in Colombia, Escobar's war with the state was spiraling. Bombings, assassinations, terror, all of it drew international attention. The Ochoas tried to keep their European ventures separate, shielded from Escobar's chaos. But in the eyes of law enforcement, it was all the same. Medellin, one name, one cartel, one enemy. The expansion to Europe also revealed the brothers' difference in vision from Escobar. He craved headlines, wanted to be remembered as a king. They craved longevity, survival. Europe was their way of diversifying, of building something that might outlast the war consuming Colombia. But Escobar's fire burned too hot. And no matter how carefully the Ochoas built abroad, they could not escape the shadow of his violence at home. Still, for a time, Europe was their triumph. They had outsmarted rivals, outmaneuvered governments, and expanded their empire across oceans. They had turned family respectability into international cover. And they had shown, once again, that the true power of the Medellin Cartel was not only Escobar's bombs, but the Ochoa's brains. But triumph has a way of breeding overconfidence. And in Europe, whispers grew louder. Spanish authorities began to notice unusual patterns of wealth. American agents traced shipments across the Atlantic. Rivals in Italy and Spain began to resent the Colombians' dominance. The Ochoas had built another empire, but empires always draw enemies. And enemies were closing in. The question was no longer whether the Ochoas could expand. They had already done it. The question was whether they could hold it, or whether Europe would become the place where their shadows were finally exposed to the light. The applause was thunderous. Men in suits, women in dresses, party officials clapping as Pablo Escobar stepped onto the stage with a smile that seemed almost innocent. A photograph was taken that night. Escobar in a crisp suit, standing beside Colombia's political elite. To the public, he was a rising congressman. To the underworld, he was the most dangerous trafficker alive. For the Ochoa brothers, the image sent a chill deeper than any bomb or bullet. Escobar had just dragged the Medellin Cartel into the spotlight, and they knew nothing good could come from it. Escobar's decision to enter politics was not impulsive. He had been building toward it for years. He sponsored soccer teams, built housing for the poor, handed out cash to the desperate. To the barrios of Medellin, he was Robin Hood. To his cartel partners, he was reckless. They thrived in shadows, in quiet deals behind closed doors. Escobar wanted the stage, the microphone, the adoration of crowds. The Ochoas had always prided themselves on discretion. Their wealth came from cocaine, yes, but their public faces remained those of ranchers, businessmen, horse breeders. They avoided cameras, avoided attention, because attention meant danger. But Escobar was different. He craved legitimacy. He wanted to be more than a trafficker. He wanted to be remembered as a leader. At first, some within the cartel humored him. His popularity in Medellin was undeniable. Poor families adored him. Political parties welcomed his money. His speeches about equality and justice rang, with just enough truth to make people forget the blood on his hands. But the Ochoas were not fooled. They knew that the higher Escobar climbed, the harder the fall would be. And when he fell, he would drag them with him. The unease grew with every headline. Newspapers began writing about Escobar not just as a businessman, but as a politician. Photos of him shaking hands with officials, sitting in Congress, smiling for cameras. For the brothers, it was like watching a fire creep toward dry grass. They could see the disaster coming, but they could not stop him. Jorge Luis, ever cautious, worried most. He understood that politics required transparency, scrutiny, investigation. And cocaine empires thrived only in secrecy. Juan David, the diplomat, tried to reassure their allies, telling them Escobar's political game was a show, that it would not last. Fabio, bold and restless, admired Escobar's audacity at first, but even he began to see the danger. Politics was not a game they could win. It was a stage where enemies would gather, waiting for their chance to strike. And strike they did. Escobar's political career collapsed almost as quickly as it rose. A single speech exposed him, a lone politician brave enough to call out his true identity, a trafficker, a criminal, a man whose wealth was built on blood and cocaine. The applause stopped. The headlines turned. Suddenly, Escobar was not a hero. He was a threat. For the Ochoas, the collapse was both a relief and a nightmare. A relief because Escobar had been forced out of politics before he dragged them further into the light. A nightmare because the exposure made him more dangerous than ever. Humiliated, furious, Escobar turned his rage back on the state. The bombs grew louder, the assassinations more frequent. His war escalated, and the brothers, whether they wanted it or not, were tied to his every act. They had always walked a delicate balance. Businessmen in shadows, traffickers disguised as ranchers. Escobar shattered that balance. His face became the face of the cartel. His violence became their violence. His war became their war. And the Ochoas had no way to separate themselves. The irony was bitter. They had helped build the Medellin Cartel precisely because it allowed them to stay hidden. Escobar's ambition had turned that shadow into a spotlight. And the spotlight burned. Perhaps, in quiet moments, The brothers wondered if they should have stopped him earlier, if they should have cut ties before politics consumed him. But Escobar was not a man who could be stopped. His ambition was like gravity, pulling everything, everyone, into its orbit, until escape was impossible. The Ochoas watched as his dreams of legitimacy turned into a nightmare of violence. They had wanted business, profit, survival. Escobar wanted history, immortality, and the two paths could not coexist. But by the time they realized just how deep his ambition had sunk them, it was too late. Their names were tied to his, their fortunes bound to his empire. His war was their war. His enemies were their enemies. And as Colombia descended further into chaos, the brothers faced the question that haunted them all. Could they survive Escobar's fire, or would they burn with him? The judge stepped out of his car, adjusting his briefcase, eyes tired from another long night reviewing case files. He barely noticed the motorcycle until it slowed beside him. A man on the back raised a pistol. 2 shots cracked through the morning air. The judge fell to the pavement, his papers scattering like white birds across the street. His name was added to a growing list, a roll call of the dead, each one silenced for daring to stand against the Medellin Cartel. This was Escobar's war on judges. And the Ochoa brothers, though they had never pulled the trigger, were trapped in the chaos he created. It began with whispers of extradition. The United States was pushing harder than ever, demanding that Colombian traffickers face trial in American courts. For Escobar, extradition was worse than death. In Colombia, money and influence could buy safety. In the United States, there would be no bribes, no safe houses, no escape. Extradition meant the end. So he declared war on anyone who dared to sign those orders. Judges, magistrates, prosecutors. The killings came one after another. Men and women who believed in the law, who thought they could stand firm against traffickers, found themselves hunted. Car bombs exploded outside courthouses. Gunmen stormed homes. Entire families lived in terror, wondering if their names would be next. Justice itself became a death sentence. The Ochoas watched with unease. They had built their empire on business, logistics, smuggling. Escobar was dragging into open war. Every killing of a judge brought more heat, more attention, more pressure from both Colombia and the United States. Jorge Luis worried about the long-term cost. Juan David tried to assure allies that business could continue, even amid the bloodshed. Fabio, restless, began to realize that Escobar's fury was not only unstoppable, it was self-destructive. And yet, they cannot break away. Their fortunes, their networks, their lives were tied to Escobar's. His war was their war, whether they liked it or not. To the world outside, there was no difference. Medellin was one cartel, one monster, one enemy. Imagine the fear in Colombia then. Judges burned case files, too afraid to sign warrants. Prosecutors resigned. Families fled the country, abandoning their homes to escape the shadow of Escobar's reach. Courtrooms became ghost towns. The very foundation of justice crumbled under the weight of fear. And in that silence, the cartel grew bolder. If the law could be silenced with bullets, then nothing was off limits. But the violence carried a heavy cost. For every judge murdered, international outrage grew. American agents tightened their grip, demanding more from Colombia. The Colombian government, humiliated and terrified, scrambled to respond. Soldiers filled the streets. Armored vehicles patrolled cities. Yet even then, Escobar's killers moved freely, as if the state itself was powerless. The Ochoas found themselves living in a paradox. Their business thrived on the back of fear, yet that same fear threatened to destroy them. They wanted silence, discretion, invisibility. Escobar wanted war, and the war was now consuming everything. At family dinners, the tension was palpable. Guards stood watch at every door. Relatives whispered about friends who had fled the country. Martha's grief over her fiancé's death had not faded, and now it mixed with the terror of seeing her family tied to escalating bloodshed. The brothers tried to comfort her, but they knew words meant little when bombs echoed in the streets. MAS had once given them a sense of power, a way to fight back against kidnappers. But Escobar's war on judges was different. This was not defense. This was scorched earth, and scorched earth leaves no place to stand. Perhaps they wondered if Escobar had lost sight of what they were fighting for. Cocaine had made them rich. But what was wealth worth if it meant living in constant fear? What was power worth if every day felt like a countdown to destruction? Still, they stayed silent, because silence was survival. To oppose Escobar outright was suicide. To distance themselves too far risked fracture. So they walked the razor's edge, pretending unity even as doubt gnawed at them. And Escobar only pushed harder. Each assassination emboldened him. Each act of terror convinced him he could bend Colombia itself to his will. Judges were not just obstacles to him. They were symbols. Symbols he wanted to crush, to prove that no one could stand above him. The Ochoas, in their quiet moments, must have seen the end already forming. They knew that no empire built on war could last forever. They knew that Escobar's fury was not just burning enemies. It was burning their own future. But once you step into the fire, there is no easy way out. Colombia bled. Judges fell. Families mourned. And the Medellin Cartel, once a business, had become a war machine. The Ochoas had always believed they could balance. That they could move cocaine like cattle, quietly, efficiently, while letting Escobar handle the blood. But now, there was no separation. To the world, they were all killers, all guilty, all responsible. And deep down, the brothers must have asked themselves a question they had always avoided. How long could they survive tied to a man who believed bullets could erase justice itself? The sun was just beginning to rise over Biscayne Bay when federal agents kicked down the door of a Miami mansion. Inside, they found stacks of cash, weapons, and traces of cocaine. It wasn't Escobar's hideout. It wasn't Gotcha's compound. It was one of the Ochoa brothers' safe houses, a piece of their empire laid bare on American soil. For the first time, the U.S. authorities weren't just chasing Medellin. They were hunting the Ochoas directly. Miami had been bleeding for years. Shootouts in malls, bodies on sidewalks, neighborhoods torn apart by cocaine wars. The DEA called it the cocaine capital of the world, and while street-level dealers and hitmen filled morgues, agents knew the real power was far away. In Medellin, in the hands of men who rarely set foot in the city they had turned into a battlefield. But as the investigations deepened, one name kept surfacing alongside Escobar's. Ochoa. The Ochoas had always believed their discretion would protect them. Escobar was the lightning rod, the face of Medellin, the man law enforcement fixated on. The brothers worked in shadows, businessmen cloaked in respectability, their names whispered but rarely printed in headlines. But shadows do not last forever. Informants began to talk. Wiretaps picked up voices. Shipments were traced back to Colombian ranches. And suddenly, the Ochoa family was no longer invisible. For the DEA, targeting the Ochoas was strategic. Escobar was volatile, unpredictable, surrounded by layers of killers. The Ochoas, however, were businessmen. They traveled. They had connections in Miami, properties in Spain, legitimate businesses that left paper trails. They could be reached. They could be cornered. Imagine the tension in Miami then. Neon lights flickered over South Beach clubs where cocaine flowed like champagne. Undercover agents, dressed as dealers, rubbed shoulders with traffickers in smoky back rooms. Every deal was a chance to get closer to the source. And the source, more often than not, pointed back to Medellin's quiet businessmen. The DEA built cases brick by brick. Surveillance of ranches, tracking of bank accounts. Informants flipping under pressure. Each piece of evidence painted the same picture. The Ochoas were not just participants. They were architects. Their shipments fed Miami. Their money laundered through businesses in Florida. Their reach extended into every corner of the city's underworld. And yet, arresting them was not so simple. Colombia was still a shield. Extradition was possible, yes, but politically explosive. The brothers knew this, and they played the game carefully. They remained in Colombia, avoiding American soil, letting lieutenants handle risky moves. They invested in businesses that looked legitimate, muddying the waters of prosecution. They were ghosts in plain sight, seen, suspected, but untouchable. But even ghosts can be cornered. In Washington, politicians demanded results. Miami was drowning, and the public wanted someone to blame. Escobar was obvious, but the Ochoas, the forgotten kings, became a new priority. The DEA gave their case a name, Operation Swordfish. It was not just about seizing cocaine anymore. It was about dismantling the men who made Medellin possible. The pressure grew relentless. American agents leaned on Colombian officials, demanding cooperation. Some resisted, fearful of cartel reprisals. Others accepted bribes to look away. But slowly cracks formed. A shipment seized here. A bank account frozen there. An ally flipping when the threat of extradition loomed too large. The walls began to close in. For the Ochoas, the pressure was suffocating. Jorge Luis grew more cautious, cutting back risky deals, moving money deeper underground. Juan David tried to charm, to negotiate, reaching out through intermediaries to calm allies and stall enemies. Fabio, restless and reckless, pushed back, insisting they could outpace the DEA, that their networks were too strong, too vast, too essential to be dismantled. But even he could feel the net tightening. The DEA wasn't only after arrests. They wanted to destroy the myth of untouchability, to show that even the quiet businessmen behind the curtain could be dragged into the light. And the Ochoas, whether they liked it or not, were now the face of that effort. Miami Vice, the television show that glamorized pastel suits and speedboats, was fiction, but the reality it was based on was darker. Real agents stalked real traffickers. Real families were torn apart by cocaine. And the real men pulling the strings were not actors on a screen. They were the Ochoa brothers, sitting in Colombia, counting profits while Miami bled. Every headline in Florida tied them tighter to Escobar's chaos. Every court case that mentioned Medellin brought their names closer to the surface. Their shadows were shrinking. And the question that haunted them was no longer how much money they could make, but how long they could avoid being dragged across an ocean in chains. Extradition. That word hung over everything. It was the nightmare that kept them awake at night. In Colombia, they had power. Judges could be bribed. Officials could be bought. Rivals could be silenced. In the United States, there would be no bribes, no deals, no escape. A life sentence in a foreign prison was the ultimate defeat. And the DEA knew it. They whispered it in every negotiation, wielded it like a blade. Silver or lead did not matter in Miami. Only extradition. The Ochoas tried to maintain calm. They told themselves Escobar would remain the target, that his violence would keep the spotlight on him. And for a while it worked. Escobar's bombs, his assassinations, his arrogance kept headlines fixed squarely on him. But in the background, agents built their case against the quieter men, the ones who kept the machine alive, even as Escobar burned it from the top down. And the machine was still running. Shipments still left Colombian coasts. Planes still flew low over the Caribbean. Couriers still carried cash back by the millions. Even as the DEA closed in, the Ochoas kept the cocaine flowing. It was both their shield and their curse. The profits made them powerful, but the profits also left trails. And trails always led somewhere. The irony was cruel. The very discretion that had protected them for so long, their careful avoidance of headlines, their refusal to flaunt wealth like Escobar, now made them more vulnerable. They could not hide behind chaos forever. They had become the logical next target. And in the late-night hours, when guards patrolled the ranches and silence hung heavy, perhaps the brothers allowed themselves to wonder, could they outlast the DEA? Could they survive the storm of extradition? Or had their empire already reached the point where no amount of wealth could shield them? Because in Miami, the war was no longer just on cocaine. It was on the men who had built its empire. And the Ochoa brothers were next in line. The crowd outside Bogotá's Palace of Justice shouted in fury, their chants echoing off stone walls. They weren't just angry. They were terrified. In their hands were signs that read a single word: extradition. For many Colombians, it meant justice. For the traffickers of Medellin, it meant death in slow motion. And for the Ochoa brothers, it was the nightmare that stalked their every waking hour. The United States had lost patience. Miami was drowning in cocaine, violence spilling into every street. Judges in Colombia were being murdered, politicians bombed, police gunned down. Washington demanded results. They demanded names. And most of all, they demanded extradition. Bring the traffickers north, try them in American courts, lock them in cells where bribes and bullets could not reach. For Escobar, extradition was a fate worse than death. He said it openly, like a mantra. He would rather die in Colombia than live in a prison in the United States. Plata o Plomo had worked on Colombian soil, but in Miami, there was no silver, only steel bars. The Ochoa brothers shared his fear, though they carried it more quietly. They had always relied on discretion, on keeping their names buried beneath Escobar's chaos. But extradition made shadows useless. Paper trails, bank accounts, seized shipments, all of it could be enough to drag them across the ocean. Imagine the tension in their ranch houses at night. Guards patrolled the fences. Families whispered over dinner, the silence broken only by the thought of what might happen if the government gave in to U.S. pressure. Jorge Luis, cautious and deliberate, saw extradition as the true endgame, the wall no money could climb. Juan David, ever the negotiator, hoped deals could be struck, alliances brokered to stall the tide. Fabio, restless, believed they could outrun it, that their wealth and influence were too deep to dismantle. But all three knew the truth. If their names landed on an extradition list, no amount of ranches, horses, or hidden cash could save them. Extradition was different from every other threat. Guerrillas could be fought. Rivals could be eliminated. Judges could be bribed. But extradition was like a hurricane forming over the ocean, unstoppable, slow-moving, inevitable. You could see it coming from miles away, and yet no matter what you did, the storm would land. The brothers watched as Escobar escalated his war against it. Car bombs outside courthouses. Politicians gunned down. Judges assassinated for daring to sign extradition papers. It was terror designed to paralyze the state. And for a while, it worked. Judges resigned in fear. Files disappeared. Families fled. Extradition stalled. But each killing only deepened the resolve of the United States. For every bullet Escobar fired, Washington sharpened its knives. The Ochoas were caught in the middle. They did not want Escobar's war. They wanted business, stability, silence. But business was now a battlefield, and silence was impossible. Their names appeared in DEA reports. Their role in Miami became clearer with every investigation. The more Escobar attacked extradition, the more the brothers' fear grew. Because they knew if the government ever truly caved to U.S. pressure, they would be among the first names on the list. Colombian streets filled with graffiti. Preferimos una tumba. En Colombia que una cárcel. En los Estados Unidos. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a prison in the United States. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a vow. For traffickers, death at home meant dignity. Extradition meant humiliation. To be dragged in chains onto a plane, locked in a foreign prison, stripped of power, stripped of respect. It was the ultimate defeat. The Ochoas were not men who chased the spotlight. They were not Escobar, craving to be remembered as a king. But humiliation was something they feared just as much. To lose everything, to have their family name tied, not only to crime, but to capture, it was unbearable. So they invested more in protection, bribed more officials, built more fortresses. But deep down, they knew none of it could stop a treaty signed on paper. And the pressure mounted. In Washington, officials promised the American public that no trafficker was beyond reach. In Bogotá, politicians debated under the shadow of Escobar's bombs. Every decision about extradition felt like a death sentence waiting to be signed. The Ochoas sent feelers, intermediaries, trying to gauge who could be trusted, who could be bought. But trust was fragile. Loyalties shifted with each explosion. Allies today could be informants tomorrow. The fear began to eat at them. Not just fear for themselves, but for their families. Extradition did not always come with dignity. It came with midnight raids, helicopters thundering over rooftops, children screaming as fathers were dragged away. The brothers imagined it vividly, and the more they imagined it, the heavier the dread became. The irony was that their wealth, the very empire they had built, had become the chain around their necks. Each dollar was another piece of evidence. Each shipment, another arrow pointing back at them. They had once believed their discretion would save them. Now, it made little difference. They were too important, too essential, too powerful to be ignored. Still, they clung to hope. Perhaps Colombia's government would resist. Perhaps fear of Escobar's violence would outweigh American demands. Perhaps deals could be made, peace struck in back rooms. But hope is fragile when surrounded by fire. And the fire Escobar had unleashed was burning brighter every day. At times, they must have wondered if Escobar's vow, to prefer death in Colombia to a prison abroad, might one day become their vow as well. Would they fight to the last bullet, or surrender to the inevitability of chains? No one could answer that yet, not even the brothers themselves. For now, they continued the business. Shipments moved, money flowed, horses grazed in pastures. But the shadow of extradition stretched over every deal, every night, every whispered conversation. It was a storm they could not stop, the cliff they could see approaching even as the machine kept moving forward. And the question that haunted them most was not just if the United States would succeed. It was who, among their allies, might sell them out first. Because in the underworld, betrayal is often cheaper than loyalty. And the brothers knew their names were already circling, waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, would hand them over. The airliner lifted into the sky, its engines roaring over Bogotá, passengers settling into their seats, unaware that history was ticking down in minutes. Hidden in the baggage hold, a bomb planted on Escobar's orders waited to explode. When it did, the jet became fire in the sky. 207 souls erased in a single act of terror. Escobar called it war. The world called it terrorism. And for the Ochoa brothers, it was the moment they knew they were chained to a man dragging them into darkness they could never escape. By the mid-1980s, Escobar's war against extradition had turned into something far bigger. It was no longer about silencing judges or intimidating politicians. It was about terrorizing an entire nation into submission. Car bombs ripped through busy streets. Shopping centers exploded without warning. Presidential candidates were assassinated in front of cameras. For Colombians, every day carried the weight of fear. For the Ochoas, every blast was another nail in the coffin of their empire. They had never wanted this. From the start, the brothers preferred business, quiet, calculated, profitable. They moved cocaine like logistics, not chaos. Escobar was chaos, and now his chaos had transformed into full-scale terrorism. Yet no matter how they tried to distance themselves, the world did not see a difference. Medellin was one monster, and their names were written in its DNA. Jorge Luis spent sleepless nights staring at maps of smuggling routes, trying to shield their business from the fallout of Escobar's bombs. He wanted continuity, some sense of control in a world spiraling out of it. Juan David played the diplomat, speaking softly in private meetings, telling allies that the brothers were not part of Escobar's terror, that they were businessmen, not killers. Fabio, restless, paced like a caged animal, furious that Escobar's madness threatened to undo everything they had built. But beneath their differences, they shared the same dread. Their fates were tied to a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Colombia itself became the battlefield. Every explosion shredded what little trust remained between traffickers and the state. The government hardened its stance. The United States doubled its pressure. Military patrols filled the streets. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Civilians lived in terror, and the Medellin Cartel became a name spoken with hatred, not awe. For Escobar, it was power. He believed bombs and bullets could bend a nation to his will. For the Ochoas, it was poison. Each attack destroyed the illusion they had carefully built of being businessmen in shadows. Now, their fortune was forever tied to terrorism. Their horses, their ranches, their wealth, all stained by association. Imagine their isolation. Allies grew cautious, fearing that proximity to the Ochoas meant proximity to Escobar's wrath. Politicians who once shook their hands now avoided them. Even other traffickers began to question whether Escobar's fire would consume them all. The Ochoas tried to step back, to whisper that they were not part of the terror. But whispers cannot drown out the sound of bombs. The bombing of Avianca Flight 203 was the breaking point. The world gasped in horror. 200 civilians, men, women, children, wiped out in an instant. The act was meant to kill a single presidential candidate. Instead, it revealed Escobar's madness to the entire planet. The Ochoas, like everyone else, watched the wreckage, the burning metal scattered across hillsides, the grieving families. And they must have asked themselves the same question the world did. Had Escobar gone too far to ever come back? The answer was yes. And yet, they were still tied to him. Their names appeared in DEA files beside his. Their smuggling routes fed his empire. Their wealth funded the machine he weaponized. They wanted to be apart from his terror. But to the world, there was no apart. They were Medellin. The pressure grew unbearable. Extradition lists grew longer. American officials pointed fingers more directly at the brothers. Colombian society, shattered by bombs, began to demand accountability not just from Escobar, but from anyone tied to him. The Ochoas found themselves standing on a fault line, caught between loyalty and survival, between silence and betrayal. Inside their ranches, conversations grew darker. Could they cut ties with Escobar? Could they break away from the cartel without becoming his enemies? Could they protect their families if they tried? Every option seemed impossible. Escobar's reach was too vast, his paranoia too sharp. To defy him was to die. To stay with him was to drown. And through it all, shipments still moved. Cocaine still flowed. Money still poured in. The machine of profit did not stop, even as bombs shattered cities. It was as if the business itself was blind, continuing on inertia while the world collapsed around it. And the Ochoas, trapped inside, kept it moving because stopping meant weakness. Weakness meant death. But the toll was heavy. Fear became constant. Every knock at the door, every phone call, every unfamiliar car outside the ranch, all felt like threats. They had built their empire to secure power and comfort. Now, that empire was a cage. Riches piled around them, useless against the dread that pressed on their chests every day. Escobar's terrorism campaign was not just about bombs. It was psychological. It made everyone, even his allies, feel unsafe. And perhaps that was his true weapon, the ability to make fear the air everyone breathed. But for the Ochoas, the suffocation was unbearable. They wanted escape. Yet where could they go? Spain, where their network stretched. The United States, where extradition meant prison. Retirement in Colombia, where guerrillas, rivals, and Escobar himself would never leave them in peace. Every road seemed blocked, every exit closed. Still, they endured. They told themselves the chaos could not last forever, that Escobar's fury would burn out, that somehow business could be salvaged from the ashes. But deep down, they knew better. Empires built on terror do not fade gently. They collapse violently. And when they do, everyone tied to them collapses too. And so the Ochoa brothers stood at a crossroads, their wealth intact, their power formidable, but their survival uncertain. They had tried to distance themselves from Escobar's madness, to remain businessmen while he became a terrorist. But history does not separate shadows from fire. In the eyes of the world, they were his partners, his allies, his brothers in arms. And soon, they would face the choice they feared most: to stand with Escobar until the end, or to find a way out before his war consumed them completely. The campaign office was quiet when the masked men burst through the doors. Guns raised, voices sharp, orders barked in chaos. Within minutes, Andres Pastrana, a rising young politician, was shoved into a waiting vehicle, his face pressed against the floor, his future hanging in the balance. Outside, Bogotá's streets carried on as normal, unaware that one of the country's most visible figures had just been swallowed into the darkness of Colombia's kidnapping wars. For the Medellin Cartel, it was more than a crime. It was a message. And for the Ochoa brothers, it was another moment where they found themselves tied to an act they neither initiated nor fully escaped. Kidnapping in Colombia had always been a weapon. Guerrilla groups used it to fund their insurgencies, to rattle the wealthy, to show the state its weakness. But by the late 1980s, even the cartels wielded it, not for money, but for leverage. To hold a politician, a journalist, a prominent name, it was to hold the government itself by the throat. Andres Pastrana was no ordinary hostage. He was young, ambitious, already carving his path toward the presidency. His abduction sent shockwaves through Colombia's fragile democracy. Newspapers screamed the headline before dawn. Families whispered in fear. Politicians looked over their shoulders, realizing that no amount of power could shield them. If Pastrana could be taken, anyone could. The Ochoas understood the weight of it. They had once been victims of kidnapping themselves, when guerrillas snatched Martha's fiancé, sparking the bloody birth of MAS. They knew the terror of waiting for news, the helplessness of families negotiating with shadows. To see the cartel itself, now tied to such acts, was bitter irony. They had built their power to shield themselves from kidnappings. And yet here they were, bound to an empire that used the same weapon they had once sworn to destroy. Jorge Luis carried the weight heavily. He feared the long-term damage, the way kidnapping eroded any claim that they were still businessmen. Juan David tried to distance their name, telling allies quietly that the Ochoas did not support such acts, that this was Escobar's fury spilling into politics. Fabio, restless, tried to focus on smuggling routes, on keeping business alive while chaos raged. But none of them could deny the truth. To the world, to the government, to the press, the Ochoas were part of the Medellin Cartel. And the cartel had kidnapped a future president. Behind the scenes, the abduction of Pastrana was not only about fear. It was strategy. Escobar and his allies believed that by holding figures of power, they could negotiate, pressure the state, force concessions on extradition and prosecution. Hostages became bargaining chips in a brutal game, where human lives were currency. And every time a hostage was taken, the cartel's reputation for terror deepened. For Pastrana himself, the ordeal was a nightmare. Blindfolded, moved from one safe house to another, guarded by men who whispered in the dark. Every hour stretched into eternity. Every sound outside the door carried the possibility of death. He later described the experience as stepping into the belly of Colombia's chaos, a place where time dissolved, where fear was constant, where survival depended on the whims of armed strangers. The Ochoas, in their ranch houses, must have felt the irony sharpen like a blade. Their family had once cried over a fiancé who never returned. Now, they were tied to a machine responsible for making other families suffer the same way. Did they feel guilt? Regret? Or did survival push those questions aside, leaving only the cold calculation of what such a kidnapping meant for their future? Because every abduction made them more vulnerable. Public anger swelled. Politicians called for harsher measures. The United States demanded action. Extradition lists grew longer. The Ochoas had once hoped to stay in the shadows, to remain the quiet partners behind Escobar's fire. But kidnappings like Pastrana's made shadows impossible. They were now part of the storm, no matter how carefully they tried to shield themselves. Pastrana, miraculously, survived. He was released days later, shaken but alive. His release was framed as a gesture of goodwill, a sign that the cartel could show mercy. But mercy in such a world was nothing more than strategy. The damage had already been done. The fear, the headlines, the proof that even a future president could be stolen from the heart of Bogotá. It lingered long after his return. And the Ochoas, though not the ones holding the gun, carried the stain of it. Business and terror were no longer separable. To traffic cocaine was to be part of kidnappings, assassinations, bombings. To profit was to be complicit. And the brothers, for all their attempts to distance themselves, could not untangle their names from Escobar's war. Imagine the unease in their meetings after Pastrana's release. Conversations hushed, eyes darting, men wondering aloud whether they had gone too far. Some argued that kidnappings gave them leverage, that fear was as powerful as money. Others worried that such acts only fueled the state's determination to crush them. And beneath the debate, one truth stood unspoken. They were losing control of the narrative. Escobar's terror now defined them all. For the Ochoas, the kidnapping of Andres Pastrana marked another step down a path they had never wanted to walk. They had entered the underworld for profit. They had endured its violence for survival. But now, they were tied to crimes that went beyond business, beyond necessity. Crimes that shocked a nation, that scarred its politics, that left wounds still visible decades later. And as the brothers tried to keep their empire intact, they faced a question more haunting than any before. How much further would Escobar's madness go? How many more kidnappings? How many more bombs? How many more lives would be consumed before the entire empire collapsed? The Ochoas had built their fortune with discretion. But in Colombia's war, discretion was dead. The kidnapping of Andres Pastrana proved that nothing, not politics, not power, not wealth, could escape the reach of Medellin. And the brothers knew that sooner or later, they too might find themselves cornered, with no way out. The gunfire cracked across the Medellin hills like thunder. Another raid. Another skirmish in a war that seemed endless. But this time, something felt different. The soldiers were not retreating. The police were not cowering. They were advancing, coordinated, relentless. Escobar's empire, once untouchable, was beginning to tremble. And the Ochoa brothers, watching from the shadows, could sense it. The fall of Escobar had begun. For years, Escobar had ruled Colombia with fire and fear. Bombs in cities, judges assassinated, politicians blown apart. He believed terror could bend an entire nation. And for a while it worked. The state faltered. Officials resigned. Extradition stalled. But terror has a half-life. With every bomb, outrage grew. With every killing, enemies multiplied. By the late 1980s, Escobar was no longer seen as Robin Hood. He was seen as a monster. And monsters draw hunters. The hunters came in many forms. The Colombian government, under crushing pressure from Washington, finally committed to all-out war. The DEA and CIA provided intelligence, funding, surveillance. Rival cartels, tired of Escobar's chaos, whispered information to authorities. And then came the most dangerous force of all, Los Peeps, a shadowy coalition of ex-paramilitaries and rivals who vowed to destroy Escobar by any means necessary. For the Ochoas, the shifting winds were undeniable. Escobar, once the shield of Medellin, had become its greatest liability. His bombs had united enemies who once fought each other. His arrogance had blinded him to the walls closing in. And the brothers, cautious by nature, knew they could not go down with him. Jorge Luis was the first to voice it. He saw the writing on the wall, the inevitability of Escobar's collapse. No empire could survive so many enemies at once. Juan David, the diplomat, agreed, though he worried about appearances. How do you distance yourself from a man like Escobar without making yourself his enemy? Fabio, ever restless, still admired Escobar's fire, but even he could not ignore reality. Escobar's days were numbered, and survival meant preparing for life after him. Still, breaking away was easier said than done. Escobar was not just a partner. He was the face of their empire. Their money, their networks, their influence, all tied to his name. To walk away was to risk his wrath. To stay was to risk annihilation alongside him. The Ochoas balanced on a razor's edge, every decision carrying the weight of survival. Meanwhile, Colombia bled. Escobar's terrorism campaign escalated even as his grip weakened. He struck harder, desperate to maintain power, but each act only pushed him further into isolation. His enemies closed in, and for the first time, the legend of his invincibility cracked. Civilians whispered that perhaps Escobar could be beaten. Officials dared to imagine a future without him. The Ochoas watched carefully. They had always valued longevity over glory. Escobar chased immortality. They chased survival. And now, survival meant something radical, the possibility of negotiation. Whispers grew that traffickers might seek deals with the government, offers of surrender in exchange for protection from extradition. For the Ochoas, it was not madness. It was strategy. Better to bend than to be broken. But bending came with risk. To negotiate was to admit vulnerability. To surrender was to gamble with trust in a government that had long been corrupt and unpredictable. Yet the alternative was worse. To go down in flames beside Escobar, hunted by Los Peeps, hounded by DEA agents, destroyed by the very empire they had built. Imagine the unease in their ranches during those nights. Guards patrolled the grounds. Lights burned late. Conversations turned somber. They still moved cocaine, still counted money, still maintained the machinery of business. But in the back of their minds, a single truth gnawed. The world was shifting, and they had to shift with it. Escobar, blinded by pride, refused to see it. He believed he could fight forever, that his name alone could hold Medellin together. But the brothers had lived long enough to know better. No man, no matter how feared, could survive when the world turned against him. And the world had turned against Pablo Escobar. The Ochoas began to prepare. Quietly, carefully, they explored paths Escobar would never take. They spoke through intermediaries, floated offers, tested the waters of negotiation. They did not announce it, did not flaunt it, because to do so was to risk Escobar's fury. But the seeds were planted. A different path was possible. And with each passing month, Escobar's empire shrank. His men defected. His allies betrayed him. His safe houses were raided. His family was harassed. He became less a king than a fugitive, running from rooftop to rooftop, hiding in shadows he once commanded. The myth unraveled in real time. The Ochoas saw it clearly. Escobar's fall was not just his. It was a warning to them all. No matter how powerful, no matter how feared, no empire built on blood could last forever. And as they watched their partner lose control, they knew their own survival depended on learning from his mistakes. But survival in Colombia was never simple. To negotiate with the state meant angering Escobar. To stay with Escobar meant facing the wrath of the state, the DEA, Los Peeps. Every choice was a trap. Every path carried death. And yet, they had to choose. To do nothing was to be swallowed in the fire. In the quiet of their homes, perhaps they thought of their father's ranches, of horses grazing peacefully, of the life they might have had if cocaine had never entered their world. But such thoughts were luxuries. Reality pressed harder. They had built an empire, and now that empire was collapsing around them. The question was not whether Escobar would fall. It was whether they could survive his fall. And as the walls closed tighter around Medellin's king, the Ochoa brothers braced themselves. For in Colombia, when one giant falls, the ground shakes beneath everyone's feet, and the tremors had only just begun. The meeting did not happen in a courtroom or a palace. It took place in shadows, guarded ranch houses, quiet back rooms, whispered conversations no one dared to record. On one side were government emissaries, nervous but determined. On the other side, the Ochoa brothers, calm but wary, carrying the weight of survival in every word. Between them hung a single, unspoken truth. The Medellin Cartel was crumbling, and deals had to be made before the fire consumed them all. Colombia was exhausted. Years of bombings, assassinations, kidnappings. The nation was drowning in blood. Escobar still raged, but his empire was shrinking. The Ochoas, unlike him, saw what came next. They knew business could not continue under constant war. They knew extradition was closing in. And so, in secret, they began to explore what had once seemed unthinkable: negotiation with the very state they had corrupted, defied, and fought against for so long. The talks were not official. They were not public. They were fragile experiments, feelers sent out to test the air. Could there be peace without humiliation? Could there be surrender without chains? Could the brothers save their fortune, their families, and perhaps their lives, by striking a deal before it was too late. The first offers were careful, almost tentative. Reduced sentences in exchange for surrender. Protection from extradition to the United States. Guarantees for their family's safety. In return, the Ochoas would give up parts of their network, dismantle operations, and step away from the war Escobar refused to abandon. It was survival by strategy, not by firepower. But every whisper carried risk. To negotiate was to admit vulnerability. If Escobar caught wind, the brothers would be branded traitors, their lives at risk from the man they had once helped crown king. If the government leaked the talks, public outrage could destroy any chance of a deal. And yet, silence carried its own danger. Without negotiation, the storm of extradition would sweep them away. Imagine the tension of those nights. Jorge Luis, calculating every word, knowing one misstep could mean death. Juan David, charming, careful, framing the talks as business, not weakness. Fabio, restless, torn between the pride of empire and the cold reality of survival. Around them, guards stood watch, guns ready, as men inside the rooms whispered about peace. The government, for its part, was conflicted. On one hand, cutting deals with traffickers felt like surrender, an admission that the state could not crush its enemies by force. On the other hand, peace with the Ochoas could isolate Escobar, weaken him, and bring an end to years of chaos. Pragmatism battled principle, and pragmatism often won. And so the dance continued. Secret meetings, drafted proposals, carefully chosen words. The Ochoas did not seek absolution. They sought survival. If they could protect themselves from extradition, if they could keep their families safe, if they could preserve some of their wealth, then surrender, on their terms, became possible. For traffickers, surrender was not like for ordinary criminals. It was negotiation, bargaining with chips that only empires could hold. Information on networks, access to routes, even peace itself, the promise of ending violence, became a weapon in their hands. They offered the government what Escobar never would, an exit ramp from endless war. But nothing in Colombia came without suspicion. Was it a trap? Would the brothers truly step back, or would they simply rebuild under new names? Could the state trust men who had spent years corrupting it? These questions haunted every conversation, every tentative handshake. Meanwhile, Escobar raged. He would never negotiate. For him, surrender was humiliation. He mocked the idea, insisting he would die on his own terms. And in his fury, he doubled down on violence. More bombs, more assassinations, more fire. And with each act, the Ochoas' arguments for peace gained strength. They could point to Escobar's madness and whisper to the government, "We are not like him. We can end this. We can step away." The irony was sharp. The brothers who had once helped build Medellin into a monster were now presenting themselves as the antidote to its poison. They had not changed out of morality. They had changed out of necessity. But in Colombia, necessity often mattered more than morality. For their families, the negotiations brought a fragile hope. Wives whispered to husbands. Children asked if the bombs would stop. Mothers prayed that their sons could finally live without bodyguards at every door. The Ochoas carried that hope with them into every meeting. For all their wealth, for all their power, what they wanted most was safety. Yet safety remained elusive. Each step toward a deal carried the risk of exposure. Journalists sniffed at rumors. Rivals speculated. Even allies began to question where the brothers' loyalties lay. Were they still cartel bosses? Or had they already become informants in disguise? In the underworld, perception was as dangerous as reality. And so the brothers walked carefully, balancing between two worlds. In one, they were still traffickers, running routes, counting money, keeping the machine alive. In the other, they were negotiators, whispering promises of peace, shaping terms for a future beyond cocaine. Each step forward in talks carried the weight of betrayal. Each shipment moved in the old business carried the stain of hypocrisy. But they pressed on, because time was running out. Escobar was falling. Extradition was looming. Los Peeps hunted without mercy. The DA tightened its grip. And the brothers knew that survival now depended not on violence, but on words. The meetings grew bolder. Drafts became agreements. Promises became paper. The Ochoas, once kings of shadows, now stood at the edge of a deal that could rewrite their fate. They were no longer fighting for power. They were fighting for a future at all. And yet, even as they edged closer to surrender, uncertainty loomed. Could they trust the government to keep its word? Could they truly step back from an empire built on blood without being dragged down by it? Would Escobar, in his fury, let them live long enough to see the deal through? The answers remained in the dark. For now, all that existed were whispers in ranch houses, secret handshakes in dim rooms, and a fragile hope that negotiation could succeed where war had failed. But hope is fragile in Colombia. And as the Ochoa brothers moved closer to deals that might save them, they knew one thing with certainty. Every secret has its price, and soon they would find out just how high that price would be. The convoy moved slowly through Medellin streets. No gunfire, no explosions, no police ambush waiting around the corner. Just silence, the kind of silence that carries the weight of history. Inside the lead car sat Jorge Luis Ochoa, his face calm but pale, his hands folded as if already resigned to what came next. Behind him, another vehicle carried Juan David. Together, two of the most powerful men in Colombia's underworld were about to do what no one had ever expected. They were going to surrender. The early 1990s were not kind to the Medellin Cartel. Escobar's war had spiraled into madness. Bombing shook Bogotá. Politicians were executed in daylight. Judges vanished beneath a hail of bullets. And yet, for all his fury, Escobar was falling. His empire shrank daily. His allies betrayed him. His enemies closed in. The Ochoas, watching the chaos unfold, had already chosen another path. Negotiations whispered in ranch houses were now becoming reality. Surrender. The word hung heavy. In a world where pride was currency, surrender was bankruptcy. For years, traffickers had sworn they would prefer a tomb in Colombia to a cell in the United States. Escobar screamed it to anyone who would listen. But the Ochoas were different. They valued survival more than legend. And survival meant compromise. Their deal with the government was delicate. In exchange for surrender, they would receive protection from extradition to the United States. They would serve prison time in Colombia, yes, but under conditions far more lenient than any American cell could ever provide. Their families would be safe. Their lives, though changed, would continue. It was not freedom, but it was not destruction either. It was a middle ground, a narrow bridge across a chasm where so many others had already fallen. On the day of their surrender, tension gripped the city. Rumors swirled. Would they show? Would the government keep its word? Would Escobar, furious at betrayal, send killers to intercept them? No one knew. The brothers themselves must have felt the weight of those questions as their cars rolled toward the authorities. Every intersection carried the possibility of an ambush. Every shadow could conceal an assassin. But still they kept driving. When they finally arrived, the moment was almost anticlimactic. No gunfights, no shouting, just signatures on paper, formalities exchanged, a few flashes of cameras. Jorge Luis, the cautious elder, stepped forward first, surrendering with the calm dignity of a man who had made peace with his decision. Juan David followed, his diplomatic smile masking the storm beneath. The government announced it as a victory. The DEA called it strategy. To Colombians, it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. For the Ochoas, it was both an end and a beginning. The end of decades spent building an empire in shadows. The end of freedom to walk their ranches without fear of arrest. But also the beginning of something else. A chance to live, to preserve their families, to step away from Escobar's fire before it consumed them entirely. Inside prison, their lives bore little resemblance to Escobar's, where he raged and schemed, demanding luxuries and building his infamous cathedral. The Ochoas were quieter. They accepted their fate with the pragmatism that had always defined them. Their cells were not harsh, their treatment far from brutal. To some, it looked less like punishment and more like protection. But for the brothers, the true punishment was not the walls. It was the knowledge of what they had lost. Their fortune remained vast, but it was fractured. Their power remained real, but it was diminished. They were no longer free men shaping an empire. They were prisoners, however comfortable, dependent on the promises of a government they had once corrupted. For men who had built their lives on control, that loss of power cut deepest. And yet, there was relief too. Relief that they had not been dragged onto an American plane in chains. Relief that their families slept without constant fear of midnight raids. Relief that, unlike Escobar, they had chosen survival over martyrdom. It was not the ending they had dreamed of when they first smuggled cocaine hidden in horse crates, but it was an ending that allowed them to breathe. Outside the prison walls, Escobar continued his war. His bombs echoed through cities. His assassins roamed streets. His name dominated headlines. But the Ochoas were no longer at his side. They had stepped away, carefully, quietly, protected by their surrender. And in that distance, a subtle truth emerged. While Escobar fought for a legacy of fire, the Ochoas fought for a legacy of survival. Not everyone saw it that way. To rivals, their surrender was cowardice. To some Colombians, it was betrayal, proof that traffickers could cut deals while ordinary families buried their dead. To others, it was proof of pragmatism, a sign that even kings of cocaine could bend when the world demanded it. Opinions varied, but the reality was simple. The Ochoas were alive, and Escobar was on the run. Perhaps at night, behind those prison walls, Jorge Luis reflected on the irony. They had once walked into the underworld to escape vulnerability, to ensure their family was never again a victim of kidnappers or poverty. And yet here they were, prisoners of their own empire, survivors of a war they never truly wanted to fight. Juan David, ever the negotiator, must have replayed conversations in his mind, wondering if the deals they struck would hold, if extradition would one day still come. Fabio, restless and untamed, remained outside longer, resisting surrender until the weight of inevitability reached him too. Each brother carried the decision differently, but all knew it had saved them. Their surrender did not end the Medellin Cartel, but it fractured it. It weakened it. It sent a message to Colombia and to the world that even its architects were seeking exits. And as Escobar's war dragged on, that message became louder than any bomb. Still, questions lingered. Could the government truly honor its promises? Could the brothers truly walk away from a life built on cocaine and blood? Could survival itself become a new kind of prison, one where the past was never truly behind them? Because survival carries its own shadows. And for the Ochoa brothers, those shadows were far from gone. Their surrender was not a final act. It was a pause, a fragile truce in a world where truces rarely lasted. And as Colombia prepared for Escobar's final chapter, the Ochoas waited, breathing easier for now, but never forgetting that in their world, peace was always temporary. The raid came before dawn. Trucks rolled through the darkness, their headlights cut, soldiers moving in silence until the command was given. Then doors splintered, boots thundered across tile floors, shouts filled the air. And there, in the chaos, the youngest Ochoa brother, Fabio, stood frozen, realizing the fate he had outrun for years had finally caught him. Unlike his brothers Jorge Luis and Juan David, who surrendered carefully through deals and backroom negotiations, Fabio had resisted. He was the youngest, the most restless, the one who always believed he could bend storm. While they sought survival through compromise, he clung to the empire they had built, unwilling to step back, unwilling to admit the war was lost. And for a time, it seemed he might succeed. Fabio had the same intelligence, the same resources, the same wealth. But he also had something more dangerous: pride. He told himself he was different. That surrender was weakness. That the government could be played. That extradition could be avoided with the right bribes, the right timing, the right allies. But pride has a way of blinding man. And in Colombia's war with Medellin, blindness was fatal. As Escobar's empire crumbled, Fabio's world shrank. Safe houses became fewer. Allies grew scarce. Soldiers once loyal began to switch sides, whispering secrets to the police, trading loyalty for survival. Every shipment carried more risk. Every meeting felt more dangerous. Fabio lived in constant motion, never sleeping in the same bed twice, never trusting a door without guards. His wealth was vast, but it had become a cage. Gold cannot buy freedom when every knock at the door might be the one that ends it. The government, under immense pressure from the United States, saw Fabio as unfinished business. His brothers were in custody. Escobar was being hunted like an animal. But Fabio, reckless Fabio, remained free, and that freedom was a symbol. To capture him was to prove that no one, not even the youngest of Medellin's kings, could escape the net forever. So they hunted. The intelligence came from a tip, whispered by someone who had once been close. A location, a house, a night when Fabio would be there. It was enough. The trucks rolled. The soldiers advanced. And when the doors came crashing down, Fabio was cornered, his empire distilled to a single room, a single moment, a single choice. He did not go out in a blaze of gunfire like Escobar would. He did not die clutching pride like a weapon. Fabio surrendered, his head lowered, his hands raised, as if finally admitting what he had refused to believe, that no man, no matter how rich, could outrun history. The news spread quickly. Fabio Ochoa, the youngest of the brothers, captured. Photographs of him, escorted by soldiers, filled newspapers. To the government, it was another victory, proof that Medellin's grip was breaking. To Colombians, it was another symbol that the nightmare was beginning to loosen. To the Ochoa family, it was a wound. For Jorge, Luis, and Juan David, already in custody, Fabio's capture was bittersweet. It meant their brother was alive, spared the fate of countless traffickers who had gone down in gunfights. But it also meant the last piece of their freedom, the last illusion that escape was possible, was gone. The family was complete again, not on ranches filled with horses and wealth, but behind bars. Fabio's prison years carried their own irony. Like his brothers, he avoided extradition through carefully crafted deals. His punishment was real, yes, but far from the cages of the United States. He lived in a Colombian prison, with walls that felt less like punishment and more like pause. For a man who had once held fortunes, once moved fleets of cocaine across oceans, it was still a fall. But it was a fall softened by privilege, money, and connections. Yet the true punishment was not the cell. It was the loss of freedom, the realization that his pride had bought him nothing but delay. Fabio had resisted surrender, telling himself he could bend fate. But fate had bent him instead, breaking the illusion that Medellin's kings could choose their own endings. Outside, Escobar's war raged on. Bombs exploded. Bodies fell. But the Ochoa brothers were out of the chaos now, held behind walls, protected by surrender and capture. Their empire was not gone, not entirely, but it was fractured, fading, bleeding out in the streets. Fabio's capture sealed it. The forgotten kings of Medellin were no longer free men. Perhaps at night, in the quiet of his cell, Fabio thought of what might have been. The horses, the ranches, the life that could have stayed respectable if cocaine had never entered their world. Perhaps he thought of his brothers, one cautious, one diplomatic, both wiser in their decision to negotiate before the storm swallowed them. Or perhaps he thought only of survival, the same instinct that had guided them all, now reduced to the simple act of enduring days behind bars. The capture of Fabio Ochoa was more than a headline. It was the closing of a chapter, the final piece in the story of three brothers who had risen to unimaginable power and then chosen three different paths to face its end. One surrendered with calm, one with charm, and one resisted, until resistance itself betrayed him. But the story was not finished. Escobar was still alive, still raging, still defiant. And the Ochoas, though contained, were still bound to his name, still tied to his fate. Fabio's capture did not end the war. It only shifted it. Because in Colombia, no prison wall, no surrender, no capture could erase the shadow of Medellin. And for the Ochoa brothers, that shadow was far from gone. The rooftop was silent, except for the sound of boots on concrete. The man who had once ruled Colombia crouched low, clutching his pistol, breath ragged, eyes darting toward the approaching voices. Then came the gunfire. A burst of shots cracked through the December air. Pablo Escobar, the untouchable king of Medellin, fell face first onto the tiles, blood pooling beneath him. It was the end of an era, an empire built on cocaine, fear, and fire reduced to a corpse sprawled on a rooftop. The news spread instantly. Radios buzzed. Newspapers rushed to print. Families whispered that the nightmare was finally over. Escobar was dead. The man who had held a nation hostage with bombs and bullets, who had declared war on judges, politicians, and presidents, was gone. And with him, the Medellin Cartel, once the most feared criminal organization on earth, was finished. But endings are rarely clean. For the Ochoa brothers, Escobar's death was not just a headline. It was confirmation of what they had seen coming for years. They had built the empire with him, brick by brick, route by route, fortune by fortune. And yet they had also stepped back, surrendered, and allowed themselves to fade before the fire consumed them. Escobar's fall was their vindication, proof that survival belonged not to the loudest, but to the quietest. The contrast was stark. Escobar had died in a blaze of gunfire, hunted like an animal, his body left for photographs that circled the world. The Ochoas, by then, were alive, serving sentences negotiated with the state, their names whispered but not shouted, their faces absent from front pages. While Escobar's legend burned, theirs slipped quietly into shadow. Still, the collapse of Medellin was not just about one man's death. It was about the dismantling of an empire. Routes once tightly controlled splintered. Networks once fueled by fear fractured. Allies turned rivals. The cocaine trade did not die. It shifted. The Cali cartel rose in its place, more discreet, more corporate, less violent, but no less profitable. The world moved on. Medellin became a memory, a cautionary tale of power built too quickly and lost too violently. For Colombians, Escobar's death was both relief and tragedy. Relief that the bombs might stop, that fear might fade. Tragedy that so many lives had been lost before the nightmare ended. The scars of his war lingered in every city, every family touched by violence. And the Ochoas, though quieter, were part of that legacy. Their fortune had fueled the machine. Their decisions had shaped the underworld. Their silence had enabled Escobar's fire. Inside their cells, the brothers must have felt the weight of it. Jorge Luis, cautious as ever, likely reflected on how close they had come to sharing Escobar's fate. Juan David, the diplomat, perhaps thought of the deals that had saved them, the words that had bought them time. Fabio, restless, must have replayed the moment of his capture, the pride that had delayed his surrender, the reality that even kings must bow eventually. Together, they carried the burden of survival. They had outlived Escobar. But survival is not the same as freedom. Their exit from the empire was not dramatic. There were no rooftop gunfights, no fiery last dance. Instead, there was paperwork, signatures, prison years, quiet release. While Escobar became immortalized in films, songs, and myths, the Ochoas faded into the background. Forgotten kings, men who had once stood at the center of the most powerful cartel in the world, now reduced to whispers and speculation. Perhaps that was their true victory. While Escobar's name was etched in blood, theirs slipped away in silence. They had always preferred shadows, and in the end, it was the shadows that saved them. Yet questions lingered. How much of their fortune survived? How much of their influence remained hidden in legitimate businesses, in ranches, in overseas accounts? Did they truly step away, or did they simply bury their empire deeper? The answers were never clear, and maybe that was by design. The Ochoas had built their lives on discretion, and discretion became their final legacy. For Colombia, the fall of Medellin marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. Violence did not disappear. The Cali cartel rose, then fragmented into smaller groups. Paramilitaries grew stronger. Guerrilla wars continued. But the shadow of Escobar and the Ochoas remained. The empire they built had reshaped the nation forever, changing its politics, its economy, its very identity. And for the Ochoa family, the end carried both relief and regret. Relief that they had survived. Regret for the blood spilled along the way. They had entered the underworld for profit, not war. Yet war had followed them anyway, consuming friends, allies, and enemies alike. In the quiet of their later years, perhaps they thought of the horses on their ranches, the lives they might have led if cocaine had never entered their world. Escobar's rooftop death was the image the world remembers. But the Ochoa's exit was something else, quieter, subtler, less cinematic, yet no less important. They were the forgotten kings, the men who built the empire, then stepped back as it burned. And in that silence, a lesson remained. In the underworld, legends die loudly. Survivors fade quietly. But even in quiet, their shadows linger. The gates creaked open slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the world outside wasn't quite sure what to do with them anymore. Jorge Luis Ochoa stepped into the sunlight first. His hair was grayer, his face lined, his frame heavier. Behind him came Juan David, thinner, calmer, a smile tucked carefully under years of caution. Later, Fabio would walk free too, his restless energy dulled, but not erased by years behind bars. For decades, they had been kings in shadows. Now, they were free men again, but no longer kings. Colombia watched quietly. There were no crowds, no protests, no fanfare, just the quiet curiosity of a nation asking itself what became of the Ochoa brothers, the forgotten architects of the Medellin Cartel. Escobar's ghost still haunted the country. His name filled books, movies, and endless retellings. But the Ochoas? They had chosen something else. They had chosen silence. Life after the cartel was not marked by speedboats or bodyguards, not by flashy cars or gunfire in the night. Instead, it was horses, ranches, family gatherings, a return to the life they had once lived before cocaine had reshaped their fate. The irony was sharp. After building one of the greatest criminal empires the world had ever seen, their ambition ended not with more power, but with a retreat into simplicity. Jorge Luis settled into a quieter rhythm, managing family businesses, walking his ranches, avoiding cameras. He never sought to retell the story, never courted the spotlight. For him, survival had always been the prize, and now he guarded it jealously. Juan David, the diplomat, kept his charm intact, but it was reserved now for family dinners, for quiet conversations, for maintaining peace in the twilight years of his life. Fabio, the youngest, remained restless, but even he found that age tempers fire. His days of evading capture were gone, replaced with routines that looked startlingly ordinary. To some, it was shocking. How could men once tied to rivers of cocaine, to fortunes beyond comprehension, live as though they were ordinary ranchers again? But that was the secret of the Ochoas all along. They had never chased glory. They had never wanted their names etched in history books. They had wanted wealth, security, survival. And when survival demanded silence, they embraced it. Still, silence carries its own weight. Their families lived with the memories. Children grew up under shadows of whispered names. Wives carried the burden of a world that had nearly destroyed them. Parents aged under the strain of watching sons transform from ranchers into cartel bosses and then into prisoners. The wealth that remained brought comfort, yes, but it could never erase the scars. And the world never truly forgot. From time to time, their names surfaced in reports, in documentaries, in courtroom files. Rumors swirled about hidden money, about offshore accounts, about fortunes buried deeper than law could ever reach. Were they truly retired? Or had they simply stepped back into shadows even darker than before? The truth was elusive, and perhaps that was intentional. Discretion had saved them once. It could save them again. In Colombia's collective memory, the Ochoas became almost ghostly. They were not saints. They were not martyrs. They were not legends like Escobar. They were survivors, men who had played their roles in a violent theater and then quietly exited the stage. Their decision to surrender, to negotiate, to live quietly afterward, became their defining difference. While Escobar's name was immortalized in blood, theirs faded into obscurity. And yet, obscurity has power. It allows one to live, to breathe, to walk freely without cameras stalking every step. The Ochoas, in their quiet years, discovered what Escobar never could. That true victory in the underworld is not found in how loudly you rise, but in how quietly you disappear. But even in disappearance, the past lingered. Every news story about cocaine carried echoes of Medellin. Every documentary about Escobar eventually mentioned the Ochoas. They were threads woven into a history that could never be untangled. And for them, perhaps the hardest part of life after the cartel was knowing that no matter how quietly they lived, the shadow would always follow. Still, they endured. They returned to ranches, to horses, to family traditions. They sought normalcy in a world where normal was always just out of reach. For Jorge Luis, it was routine. For Juan David, it was diplomacy in miniature, keeping peace within family walls. For Fabio, it was restless acceptance, a life smaller than he had once imagined, but still a life. The Ochoa brothers' post-cartel years became proof of a truth few wanted to admit. Not all narco stories end in bullets. Some end in silence, in slow fades, in lives lived just outside the glare of history. They had been forgotten kings, and in forgetting, they had found their survival. And yet, questions linger. Was silence their redemption, or simply another form of power? Did they regret the blood spilled, the family shattered, the country scarred? Or did they see themselves only as businessmen caught in a storm too big to escape? The answers, like their lives, remain in shadows. The Medellin Cartel died loudly. The Ochoa brothers lived quietly. And somewhere between those two truths lies their legacy. The photograph of Pablo Escobar's body on that rooftop has circled the world countless times. His mustache, his bloated face, his blood soaking into the tiles. It is burned into history, the final image of a man who once believed he could bend a nation to his will. His story has been retold endlessly, in books, in movies, in glossy television series that turned him into both villain and anti-hero. Escobar became immortal, even in death. But what of the men who stood beside him? The men who built the machine that made his legend possible? The Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, Fabio. Without them, Medellin would never have become what it was. They were the quiet architects, the businessmen who structured routes, laundered money, expanded into Europe, stabilized the empire when Escobar's chaos threatened to tear it apart. They were not the fire. They were the foundation. And yet, history barely speaks their names. Ask most people today, and they'll know Escobar. They'll know the bombs, the hippos, the Robin Hood mythology. But the Ochoas? They are ghosts, fading at the edges of memory, remembered only by those who dig deeper. Forgotten kings in an empire of cocaine. Perhaps that was by design. From the beginning, they preferred shadows. Escobar craved cameras, headlines, applause. The Ochoas craved wealth and survival. Their discretion was their strength, and in the end, it was their salvation. While Escobar's name is synonymous with death and destruction, there slips quietly into the footnotes. It is the price of silence, but also its reward. Still, erasure is not innocence. The Ochoas were not bystanders. They were not victims of circumstance. They were partners in one of the bloodiest criminal enterprises of the 20th century. Their money flowed into bombs, into assassinations, into the machinery of terror. Their routes fed the cocaine epidemic that reshaped cities from Miami to Madrid. Their decisions left scars across Colombia that will never fully heal. And yet, the way history remembers them, or forgets them, says something larger. We remember the fire, not the architects who built the furnace. We remember the explosions, not the men who paid for the dynamite. Escobar became the face because he wanted it. The Ochoas became shadows because they needed it. And shadows rarely make it into history books. Imagine sitting with them now, in their old age, in ranches far quieter than the jungles they once commanded. Jorge Luis, still cautious, reflecting on the deals that saved him. Juan David, smiling softly, remembering the diplomacy that bought them time. Fabio, restless even in later years, perhaps wondering if he should have surrendered sooner. Do they feel relief? Regret? Do they believe history has judged them fairly? Or do they welcome the forgetting as another kind of victory? Because survival itself is a kind of victory. Escobar's empire ended with bullets. His family fled. His name became both myth and curse. The Ochoas, in contrast, walked free eventually. They lived quietly, with families, with horses, with enough fortune preserved to remain comfortable. They were never celebrated, but they were never truly destroyed either. In a world where most traffickers end in blood, that quiet ending was extraordinary. Still, obscurity is fragile. Every so often, their names surface again. A news report about hidden accounts, a rumor about laundering, a documentary that pulls them briefly back into the light. But then they fade again, swallowed by Escobar's shadow. He monopolized history, and in doing so, he shielded them, even in death. The forgotten kings of Medellin. Kings who built an empire and then chose to vanish from it. Kings who never wanted to be remembered, and so were not. And yet, forgetting them does not erase the truth. Without the Ochoas, there is no cartel. Without their networks, Escobar is just another smuggler, limited and volatile. They made him bigger than he could have ever been alone. They gave his chaos structure, gave his fire fuel. They were the scaffolding that held up the legend. History loves fire. It forgets scaffolding. But both are part of the same building. And so the story of Medellin ends with two legacies. Escobar's, loud, bloody, immortalized. The Ochoas, quiet, shadowed, forgotten. One remembered too much. The other remembered too little. Both changed Colombia forever. Perhaps that is the final irony. The Ochoa brothers spent their lives mastering discretion, living in shadows, avoiding attention. And in the end, they succeeded so completely that history itself has let them slip away. Forgotten by most, survived by few. Their empire a ghost, their names faint echoes. But for those who look closely, for those who pull at the threads of Medellin's story, the truth remains. They were kings. They were architects. They were survivors. And though history may forget them, Colombia never will. Picture the scene. A quiet ranch in Colombia, years after the wars, the bombs, the chaos. Horses graze lazily in the fields. Children play without bodyguards watching every step. And sitting on a shaded veranda, older now, heavier, quieter, one of the Ochoa brothers leans back in his chair. No cameras, no microphones, no reporters, just silence. The same silence that carried them through the rise and fall of the Medellin Cartel. The same silence that history itself has wrapped around their names. Without the Ochoa brothers, Escobar might have been just another dealer. That is the truth history rarely says out loud. He had charisma, ruthlessness, the appetite for violence. But power, real power, requires more than fire. It requires structure. It requires money that moves like water, networks that stretch like roots, logistics that make the impossible look inevitable. Escobar was the face, but the Ochoas? They were the architects. Their wealth came first, long before cocaine turned Medellin into a global capital of crime. Horses, ranches, legitimate businesses, a respected family name that opened doors. When the cocaine trade offered riches, they did not dive blindly. They measured. They built carefully, always preferring efficiency over chaos, discretion over noise. And in those choices, they created the foundation of an empire. It was the Ochoas who turned cocaine from a smuggler's gamble into an organized system. They built smuggling routes through Miami, then expanded across oceans into Spain and beyond. They moved money through businesses that looked clean on the surface, while below, they carried the weight of billions. They negotiated with allies, balanced rivalries, and played the role of diplomats in a world where every handshake might conceal a knife. Escobar, of course, became the legend. His bombs, his bravado, his arrogance made headlines. But for every explosion, there was an Ochoa shipment crossing a border quietly. Another load moved without a sound. For every photograph of Escobar in a suit, there was an Ochoa counting profits behind closed doors. They gave him stability when his violence threatened to unravel everything. They gave him reach when his ambition exceeded his grasp. And yet, history left them in the shadows. Ask the world today about Medellin, and you'll hear Escobar's name first, maybe Gotcha, maybe even mention of Cali. Rarely do you hear Jorge Luis, Juan David, or Fabio. Their names slip by unnoticed, swallowed by Escobar's legend. It is the irony of the underworld. Those who shout are remembered, those who whisper survive. But survival is not the same as innocence. The Ochoas were not passive partners. They were not reluctant victims dragged into Escobar's fire. They were beneficiaries, builders, profiteers. Their choices allowed the cartel to become the most powerful criminal syndicate on earth. Their caution kept the machine alive longer than Escobar's rage ever could have. And their negotiations, their eventual surrenders, showed a pragmatism Escobar refused to learn. Still, the silence they mastered shielded them. While Escobar's end came in blood on a rooftop, the Ochoas stepped away with quieter exits. Jorge Luis and Juan David surrendered peacefully, negotiating terms that spared them the nightmare of extradition. Fabio, restless, resisted, but even his capture was not the fiery spectacle of Escobar's last stand. They served time, yes, but in Colombia, in conditions far from the cages of the United States. And eventually, they walked free. Life after the cartel did not bring them back to power, but it gave them something Escobar never had: longevity. They returned to ranches, to horses, to family gatherings. They blended into silence again, their names surfacing only when journalists or historians pulled at threads of Medellin's story. They became the forgotten kings, men who built an empire and then let history bury them under Escobar's shadow. But the question lingers: is forgetting them fair? Or is it another way the world simplifies its villains, choosing one face to hate and letting others slip by? Because without the Ochoas, Escobar's story is smaller, thinner, less inevitable. Without their wealth, connections, and strategy, he might have remained just another trafficker, brutal but limited, dangerous but local. They made him global. They made him immortal. History remembers fire because fire is dramatic. But buildings do not burn without architects. The Ochoas designed the structure that Escobar set aflame. And while the flames draw our eyes, the structure remains their legacy. Perhaps this is why their story feels unfinished. They did not die violently, and so their ending lacks the cinematic closure audiences crave. They did not confess fully, and so their motives remain cloaked in ambiguity. They did not claim glory, and so history moved on without them. But their silence, deliberate and careful, might have been their greatest strategy of all. In a world where noise meant death, silence meant survival. Still, survival comes with shadows. Families whisper. Children inherit names stained with history. Ranches, no matter how peaceful, carry ghosts of shipments once hidden among horses. Every quiet dinner carries the weight of what was once built, once destroyed, once survived. And in that silence lies the burden of being forgotten kings. What does it mean to be remembered less than you deserve, and more than you want? The Ochoas live in that paradox. Too guilty to be innocent, too discreet to be infamous. Shadows behind Escobar's flame. Silent architects of an empire remembered only for its explosions. And maybe that is the final lesson. In the underworld, the loudest often fall first. The ones who crave legend end in blood, their names etched in history's darkest chapters. The ones who crave survival fade into silence, their names half remembered, their roles understated. but both shape the world they leave behind. The Medellin Cartel ended in fire. Escobar's body sprawled on that rooftop became the image of its demise. But its rise, its structure, its reach, its global power was born in quieter places, in ranches and back rooms, in strategies drawn not by the man with the bombs, but by the brothers who preferred shadows. The Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, Fabio, forgotten kings, silent architects. And though history may not shout their names, the empire they helped build whispers their legacy still.